I was 32 the year I decided to hike and camp solo in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. It was the summer of 2019, late July, and I had taken 2 weeks off from my job in Missoula, where I worked in a small print shop. I'd done a lot of shorter backpacking trips before, usually 2 or 3 nights max, and I had always gone with friends. This time, I wanted to be alone, to get away from everything. Phones, traffic, even people. I thought a solo trip would help me reset. I'd been feeling burnt out, tense all the time, and I thought maybe a week alone in the woods would bring me back to baseline. I picked a trail I had read about in a few forums. It wasn't part of any official guide, which was a big part of the appeal for me. Less traffic, fewer people. It wasn't uncharted or anything, just one of those hidden gems passed around by word of mouth. It started near a small turnout off a Forest Service road, snaked up through several ridges, and eventually crossed an old fire lookout tower that was supposedly still standing. Most people did it as a day hike or an overnighter. I planned to make it my base for a longer route, about 5 days round trip with some off-trail exploring. I packed my gear, extra food, water filtration, and a satellite GPS device just in case. Day 1 went by smooth. I parked my car at the trailhead, left a note on the dash about where I was going and when I planned to return. The trail was mostly dry, shaded by lodgepole pine and tamaracks, and the temperature stayed in the low 80s. I hiked about 10 miles the first day, moving slow, taking my time. I stopped often to enjoy the quiet. No traffic, no hum of electricity, just birds and wind. I set up camp in a small clearing just below the first ridge, filtered some water from a nearby stream, and cooked a freeze-dried meal. That night, I lay in my tent, staring up at the nylon roof, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The second day, I pushed higher up. The trail got steeper and more overgrown. I passed no one. I didn't even see any boot prints in the dirt. At some point around midday, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn at an unmarked fork, really just a faint game trail that veered left. I backtracked and found the main trail again, but it put me behind schedule, and I made camp earlier than planned near an alpine meadow. The wind picked up that night, rustling the tall grass and shaking the tent. It wasn't stormy, just gusty. Still, I had trouble falling asleep. Something about the way the wind moved through the trees made me uneasy. I chalked it up to being alone and tried not to let my mind wander. By day 3, I was deep in. No cell service, no sign of other hikers. I reached the old fire lookout around noon. It stood on a rocky outcrop, weather-beaten and empty. The steps were still intact, and I climbed up, hoping for a good view. From the top, I could see the endless green stretching in every direction, broken only by a few narrow dirt paths. I spotted a few lakes in the distance and made a mental note to head toward one of them the next day. That night, I camped near a cluster of fallen logs just below the lookout, where the ground was flat. I noticed something that bothered me, though I couldn't quite say why. There was a faint trail near my camp that didn't look natural. It was too wide, too cleared of debris. It wasn't marked on any map, and I hadn't seen any signs, but it looked traveled. Not heavily, but used. I figured maybe hunters had come through, or maybe it was a fire service access path. I didn't give it much more thought until I saw something else. Near the edge of my campsite, someone had driven a wooden stake into the ground. Not a natural piece of wood, a shaped, sanded one like a surveyor's marker. But it had no flag, no writing, just a sharp point and weathered wood. I pulled it out of the dirt and tossed it aside, telling myself it was probably old. Still, that night I had trouble sleeping again. The wind had died down, but the woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I woke up at some point after midnight to the sound of something moving outside my tent. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It wasn't wind. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching over dry leaves and pine needles. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too steady. I stayed perfectly still and listened as the steps circled the tent once, maybe twice, then stopped. I lay there in total silence, waiting. Minutes passed, then more. I never heard them leave. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until sunrise, then unzipped the tent and stepped out with my knife in one hand. I didn't see anyone. No animals, no people. But I did find boot prints. Human ones. They circled my tent and led back toward that same faint trail I'd noticed the night before. I followed them a few steps into the woods, just far enough to see that they continued along that unmarked path. My gut told me to leave, to pack up and head back the way I came. But I was already halfway through my planned route, and if I turned around, I'd have to cover the same distance either way. I convinced myself it was just a hunter or some local checking on the old lookout. Maybe they didn't realize I was there. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Still, I kept my knife closer that day, and I didn't take off my pack even when I stopped to rest. That afternoon, I reached one of the small lakes I'd seen from the lookout. The water was clear, icy cold, and surrounded by granite boulders. I set up camp well back from the shore, near a cluster of trees, trying to stay out of sight. I didn't start a fire that night, even though it was cold. I didn't want the smoke to give me away. I ate a cold meal and lay awake long after sunset. Sometime in the early hours, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time I was sure they had followed me. Same slow, steady pace. Same pause just outside the tent. This time they didn't circle. They just stopped. Then I heard something new. A soft sound, like metal tapping on metal. Not loud, not fast. Just a slow, irregular clink. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. My heart felt like it was going to pound out of my chest. The sound went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. And then nothing. At dawn, I got out and checked again. More boot prints. Same kind, same tread. I found the source of the metallic sound, too. A small tin cup, the kind people use for camping, was hanging on a low tree branch about 20 feet from my tent. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't use tin cups. I used a plastic one that collapsed into my cook set. This one looked old, dented, and had some kind of reddish-brown stain along the rim. That was it for me. I packed up immediately and changed course. I didn't even bother with the map trail. I just used my compass and GPS to cut southeast, heading toward the nearest forest road. It meant bushwhacking through dense forest and climbing up and down some nasty ridges, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I moved fast, barely stopping to eat or rest. The next night, I didn't set up a tent. I hiked until well after dark, then just sat against a rock with my pack on, dozing in short bursts. I didn't hear any footsteps that night, but that might have been because I kept moving. I made it to the road late the following afternoon. I was exhausted, scratched up, filthy, but I felt a massive wave of relief when I saw the dirt road and the faded tire tracks. I followed it for hours until I reached a small service station used by fire crews. It was locked up, but I had enough signal to send an emergency ping from my GPS. 2 hours later, a ranger showed up. He gave me water and let me sit in the cab while he radioed it in. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd gotten turned around and run out of food. I didn't mention the footsteps, or the cup, or the stakes. I wasn't sure he'd believe me. I wasn't even sure what I believed. I never went back to that trail. I sold most of my camping gear within the year. I still hike, but I stay close to home now, places with people, rangers, trail markers. I don't sleep out there anymore. Not alone. What really got to me wasn't the footsteps or the cup or even the prints. It was the idea that someone had followed me out there, deep into the woods without ever making themselves known. No confrontation, no words, just silent watching, for nights. And the worst part, I still don't know why. I was 34 that summer, working from home as a freelance photographer in Syracuse, New York. By the time August rolled around in 2019, I was burnt out from weeks of editing wedding pictures and event shoots. My sleep schedule was trashed. I wasn't eating right. I hadn't been outside for more than a few hours in weeks. It was one of those stretches where I felt like my body was shutting down just from being inside too long. One afternoon, I shut my laptop and stared at the wall for a good 10 minutes. That's when I decided I needed to get away, even if just for a few days. I didn't want to go to a hotel or visit anyone. I didn't want to see people at all. I just wanted silence and fresh air. I remembered a guy I'd met in a photography forum who once mentioned a quiet spot near Stillwater Reservoir in the western Adirondacks. He'd said it was beautiful but not very crowded, with access to a few primitive campsites off a narrow gravel road. I looked it up, packed my gear, and left the next morning. Took about 4.5 hours to drive up there. The last part was slow, going miles of winding, bumpy roads with barely any signage, but the place was exactly what I'd hoped for. Thick trees on all sides, deep green and endless, with no sounds except for wind, birds, and the occasional creak of trees rubbing together. I drove about 2 miles down a rough, rutted track that branched off the main road and found a pull-off that led to a small clearing near the water. It looked like someone had camped there maybe weeks ago, but it was totally empty when I arrived. There was a fire ring made of stones, and the trees opened just enough to let in the morning sun. I set up my tent near the edge of the tree line, away from the low brush by the water. I had a small propane stove, a cooler of food, and my camera gear. There was no reception, but I liked that. I turned my phone off and left it in the car. My plan was to stay 3 nights, just enough to reset my brain. The first night went how I hoped. I cooked rice and beans, sipped some whiskey, and watched the sunset through the trees. It got cold fast after dark, but I had my thermals and a good sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest at night were surprisingly loud. Frogs, crickets, things rustling in the underbrush, but none of it felt threatening. It was peaceful. I fell asleep quick and woke up a little after 6 the next morning, feeling better than I had in weeks. I spent most of that second day hiking around the area. There was a trail that led up a ridge where I took photos of the lake and the forest canopy. The elevation wasn't much, maybe a few hundred feet, but the view was perfect. No roads in sight, no power lines, no buildings, just trees stretching in every direction. That evening, I gathered some wood and lit a small campfire. I sat next to it, ate a simple dinner, and watched the flames die down slowly. The air smelled like pine and damp moss. At one point, I thought I heard something splash in the water nearby, but when I stood and looked out over the lake, there was nothing. Could have been a fish, I figured. I went to sleep around 10, tired but content. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed something that made me uneasy. I'd taken off my boots before bed and left them just outside the tent door like I always do. When I woke up, one of them was lying about 6 feet away, half buried in some pine needles. I don't remember hearing anything during the night, and the tent was zipped tight from the inside. No rips or damage. Nothing taken. Just that one boot moved for no reason. I looked for animal tracks but didn't see any. It had rained lightly overnight, so the ground was soft enough that you'd expect to see prints. There weren't any, just some small indentations from my boot where it had been dropped. I brushed it off, assuming some animal had carried it a little ways and dropped it. Maybe a raccoon or something. I checked the rest of my gear and found nothing else out of place. Still, it stuck in the back of my mind all day. That day, I took fewer photos and stayed closer to camp. I read a bit, tried to sketch in a notebook I'd brought, and collected more wood for the fire. Around mid-afternoon, I started to feel a kind of pressure in the air. It was subtle at first, but by late evening, the wind picked up sharply and the temperature dropped. I checked my phone to see if I could pull up a forecast, but still no signal. By the time night fell, clouds had rolled in, and the moon was completely hidden. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. I had a weird feeling in my stomach, like I'd missed something. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. That feeling you get when someone's watching you, even if you can't see them. Around 11 p.m., I put out the fire and got in my tent. I zipped it up, climbed into my sleeping bag, and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind had settled, but the woods were too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling leaves, just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, maybe 50 feet away, coming from the direction of the water. Slow and deliberate, not an animal, too steady. Person walking. The sound grew closer, then stopped completely. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited. Minutes passed. Then I heard the soft crunch of pine needles right outside the tent. Not walking anymore, shifting weight, almost like someone trying to be quiet but standing still. I felt my heart pounding in my throat. I didn't have any weapons, just a hatchet I'd used to split firewood, and it was outside the tent. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. The noise eventually stopped, but I didn't hear it walk away. It just stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I kept still until the first light showed through the thin nylon of my tent. Then, finally, I unzipped the door and stepped out. Nothing. No sign of anyone.
No footprints.
No gear. The fire pit looked untouched. My supplies were where I'd left them. But then I noticed something farther out near the edge of the clearing. Some kind of mark in the dirt. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly. Just a faint indentation, like someone had been crouched there. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to look anymore. I just packed. Took me less than an hour to tear everything down and throw it all into the back of my car. I didn't eat. I didn't even refill my water. I just drove. The gravel road felt 10 times longer than it had coming in. Every bump and jolt felt like it might snap an axle. I kept checking my mirrors. I didn't relax until I hit pavement again and saw another car. A white sedan parked at a trailhead 5 miles from where I'd camped. Back in Syracuse, I told myself it had probably just been another camper, maybe some weirdo trying to scare people. But no one had any reason to be out there. There were no other sites nearby, no other cars. And the way they moved, the silence of it, the way they stopped right outside and then nothing, didn't feel right. I never went back to that spot. I don't think I ever will. I still go camping sometimes, but only in designated areas now, where I can see other people and where there's cell service. I bought a small satellite beacon too, just in case. I don't know what that person wanted. I don't know how long they were watching me, but I do know this. Someone was out there, and they knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and when I was most vulnerable. And they didn't need to say a word to make it clear I wasn't welcome. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had been working a stressful job in the city for years, and the constant noise and rush were starting to wear me down. I wanted to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere I could be alone with just nature. I found a small state park in northern Michigan, a place not too far from the lake, surrounded by thick forests and winding trails. It seemed perfect. The map showed a few backcountry campsites, spots far from any roads or other campers. I picked one of those spots. I was 29 then, not too young but not old either, and I thought I was prepared. I packed lightly but carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, basic cooking gear, a first aid kit, plenty of water, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, and a small hatchet. I made sure to bring enough food for a few days. Canned beans, granola bars, dried fruit, and some beef jerky. I left early on a Thursday morning, wanting to get to the campsite by afternoon. The drive was peaceful, the city melting away behind me with every mile. As I got closer, the air smelled fresher, cooler, and the trees grew taller and denser. I arrived at the trailhead around noon and double-checked my backpack. The hike in was just under 5 miles. The trail was narrow, winding through thick pine forests, and sprinkled with patches of wildflowers and ferns. Birds chirped overhead, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. The kind of place that felt untouched. I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I liked being alone, but I knew being so far from others meant I needed to stay alert. The hike was tougher than I expected. The trail climbed over rocky ridges and crossed small streams. My boots got muddy from the damp earth, and sweat ran down my back, but the quiet of the forest made it worth it. Occasionally, I stopped to drink water and rest, listening to the wind brushing through the trees or watching a squirrel dart up a trunk. By late afternoon, the sun was starting to dip low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Finally, I reached my campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks, a few large rocks scattered around. A shallow stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss. I felt a wave of relief and accomplishment. I set up my tent carefully, pounding stakes into the ground with my hatchet, then unpacked my gear. I found a spot for my fire pit and gathered dry wood and kindling nearby, careful not to take too much from any one place. As the sun faded, I built a small fire and cooked some canned beans in my pot. The warmth from the fire was comforting, and the smell of smoke mixed with pine made me feel at home. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. When night fully arrived, I turned off my flashlight and lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent, staring at the dark fabric ceiling, listening to the sounds outside, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl. The first night was peaceful. I woke a few times to the sounds of animals moving nearby but never felt threatened. The fresh air helped me sleep better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke early, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. I ate some granola and dried fruit and decided to explore the area. I followed the stream upstream, careful to step on rocks to keep my boots dry. The forest was dense, the trees old and towering. The ground was soft and mossy, and I spotted small animal tracks, maybe deer or raccoons. After a few hours, I returned to camp and spent the afternoon reading a book I had brought along and taking short naps in the shade. I kept the fire small and controlled. The day passed quietly, and the sun dipped again. That night, something felt off. I noticed how dark the forest seemed once the fire died down, the shadows deeper, more alive. I lay awake longer than before, listening closely to every sound. At one point, I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the far side of the clearing. My heart jumped. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they began. I sat still, breath held, waiting, but nothing else happened. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, nothing to worry about. Still, I decided to keep my knife close and the flashlight within reach. The following day was overcast, clouds covering the sky and dropping the temperature. I didn't feel like hiking far, so I stayed near camp, cleaning and organizing my gear, refilling my water bottle from the stream, and collecting more firewood. The forest was quiet again, but I noticed some broken branches near the edge of the clearing, like something heavy had brushed through. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. That night was worse. The footsteps returned, this time multiple, slower, circling the camp. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs breaking under heavy boots. It was too steady to be an animal. My mind raced with all kinds of possibilities, maybe hunters or other campers. But I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and my campsite was far from any road. I kept my flashlight on the tent wall, shining out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped after a while, and the forest fell silent again. I tried to calm my nerves, reminding myself I was safe in my tent. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft soil near the stream, large, booted prints not like mine. They circled the campsite and vanished into the woods. I felt a deep chill run down my spine. Someone had been there last night. I debated leaving, but I had come this far and wanted to finish my trip. I stayed alert, packing a small emergency bag with essentials and my knife always close. I avoided making fire at night and kept my flashlight ready. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I noticed small things out of place. A rock moved from its spot, some food packages shifted. It was clear someone had been around. That evening, I decided to sleep with my knife under my pillow and my flashlight on high. I left the tent flap slightly open to see outside without exposing myself. Around midnight, the footsteps came back, louder, closer. This time, they stopped right outside my tent. I heard heavy breathing and the soft scrape of something dragging on the ground. I froze, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped my knife, ready to defend myself. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move past the tent's edge. My flashlight's beam caught a glimpse of a man crouched nearby, wearing dark clothes, a backpack slung low. My mind screamed at me to run or fight, but I stayed still, waiting. The man stayed there for a long moment, then finally stood up and disappeared into the trees. I didn't hear footsteps retreating, just the rustle of leaves and breaking branches. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When dawn finally arrived, I packed everything with shaky hands, not wanting to leave any trace behind. I took one last look around the campsite, the broken branches, the footprints, the disturbed ground. Whoever had come here had been watching me, maybe even stalking me. I started hiking out immediately, moving faster than I had on the way in, eyes constantly scanning the trees. The trail back seemed longer, every snap of a twig making me jump. I reached the trailhead exhausted and relieved, sliding into my car and locking the doors. On the drive back to the city, I kept thinking about what had happened. I realized how vulnerable I had been alone in the forest, and how easy it would have been for someone to hurt me. I told myself I had been lucky. Maybe it was just a hunter or a local who liked to sneak around the park. Maybe it was someone else entirely. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. That trip changed me. It made me respect the wilderness, not just for its beauty, but for its dangers. I still love camping, but now I go with others and make sure someone always knows where I am. I never went back to that campsite. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are better left alone. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. I was 28 years old, working a stressful job in a small town, and the noise of everyday life had become too much. I wanted to be alone, to feel the quiet of the woods and forget about everything for a while. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty old flashlight. I also took my pocket knife and a map of the area. I had camped a few times before, but always with friends. This was my first time alone. The night before I left, I double-checked everything. I told my sister where I was going and when I'd be back. She didn't ask many questions, probably used to my strange hobbies by now. I arrived at the Black Hills late morning. The air was fresh and cool, even for mid-July. The forest was thick with tall pine and spruce trees, their dark green needles blocking some of the sunlight. The smell of pine sap and damp earth filled my nose as I parked my car at the trailhead. I strapped my backpack tighter and set off on the narrow dirt path that would lead me to a clearing I'd picked from the map, about 4 miles in. The walk was peaceful. Birds sang quietly in the trees, and the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the brush made the forest feel alive. I breathed deeply, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly ease. I didn't see many other people. The trail was mostly empty. After about 2 hours, I reached the clearing I wanted for my campsite. It was a small flat area surrounded by tall trees. A fallen log made a perfect bench, and the ground was covered with soft pine needles. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the soil and arranging my sleeping bag inside. I made a small fire ring from stones I found nearby and gathered dry twigs and branches to start a fire later. The sun was beginning to lower when I finished setting up. I took a moment to sit on the log, looking out at the thick forest surrounding me. The shadows were growing long, and the forest began to feel cooler and darker. I made myself a simple dinner, instant noodles and some canned beans, and ate slowly, listening to the quiet sounds of the woods at dusk. After eating, I built a small fire in my fire ring. The flames crackled and popped, sending warm light dancing across the trees. I sat close, watching the smoke rise and thin, twisting ribbons. I felt content, almost peaceful. But as the sun disappeared completely, a strange feeling crept in. The darkness outside the circle of fire seemed too deep, too thick. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I shook the thought away and got ready for bed. I zipped my tent door shut, leaving a small flap open for fresh air. My flashlight was by my side, the batteries fresh. I laid down, staring at the thin mesh above me where I could see the stars twinkling faintly. Then I heard it, a soft noise coming from just beyond the firelight. It was a rustling, like something moving through dry leaves. My heart jumped. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped. I waited a few minutes, but the silence that followed was heavier, as if something was watching me from the dark. I wasn't scared yet. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Animals were common here, and the forest was their home. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the noises kept coming in fits and starts. Small cracks, the snap of a twig, the soft shuffle of feet moving quietly. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees began to creak and moan, and the fire flickered wildly. I reached for my flashlight and shone it outside, but the beam quickly disappeared into thick shadows. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft earth near my fire ring. Large, heavy prints that hadn't been there before. They were too big to be from a deer or coyote, and they led straight from the tree line to the edge of my camp. I stared at them for a long moment, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I had no idea who or what had come so close. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I didn't hear any voices or other sounds to suggest another person was nearby, just the forest noises. The night grew colder, and the wind sounded like whispers through the branches. Every time the fire died down, I had to add more wood to keep it alive. The footprints seemed to circle around the clearing, appearing here and there like the work of something pacing. My mind raced, imagining all kinds of possibilities. Maybe a hunter or a lost hiker. Maybe a wild animal bigger than I expected. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like movement. I kept my pocket knife close and my flashlight ready. I told myself to stay calm, to remember that I was alone but prepared. Around 3 a.m., the noises changed. I heard something heavy crashing through the brush, breaking small branches and stomping on the undergrowth. It was close. I could hear it moving fast toward the camp, then stopping suddenly. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I reached for my flashlight and swung it around outside the tent. For a moment, I saw a dark shape. Too big for a deer, taller than a person, but not quite human. It was covered in mud and leaves, almost like it had been crawling on the ground. I froze, unable to move or breathe. The shape didn't move for a long time, just stood there on the edge of the firelight, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and ran back into the forest with heavy steps. I sat trembling for a long time, the fire almost out, the cold air creeping inside the tent. When the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, I finally felt brave enough to leave the tent and explore the clearing. I followed the path the creature had taken, finding broken branches and large footprints pressed deep into the soil. It had circled the camp at least twice, then left. No other signs, no tracks leading anywhere clear. I packed my gear quickly, eager to get back to my car and away from this place. The forest that had felt peaceful the day before now seemed dangerous and unpredictable. As I walked back along the trail, I thought about what I had seen. Couldn't have been a person, no one looked like that. Couldn't have been a bear or a wild animal I knew of either. The shape was strange, unnatural in size and movement. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat for a long time, trying to calm down. I called my sister and told her I was coming home early. I didn't want to say why. In the weeks that followed, I told a few close friends about what happened. Some said maybe it was a mountain lion or a very large bear, but the size and way it moved didn't fit any animal I knew of. Others joked I had seen a person covered in mud playing a prank, but I knew no one was that close or that quiet in the woods at night. I never went back to the Black Hills for camping again. The memory stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the heavy footsteps circling my camp, the dark figure just on the edge of my flashlight's beam. But I also learned something important that night. No matter how prepared you are, the wild is unpredictable. It doesn't care about your plans or your safety. And sometimes what you think you know about nature isn't the full story. I kept camping, but only in places where I wasn't truly alone. And whenever I think about that night, I remind myself to respect the forest and its unknowns, no matter how tempting the silence and peace might seem. The woods are not just trees and animals. They hold something else, something heavy and quiet that I still don't understand. But I learned to live with that, and more importantly, to leave the forest alone when it shows you its darker side. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in the wilderness. I was 27 years old, working a stressful job in marketing, and needed to clear my head. The place I chose was a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, a place I had heard was beautiful but not too far from civilization. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cooler temperatures, a small camping stove, enough food for 5 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a headlamp, extra batteries, a reliable pocket knife, and my hiking boots that had seen better days but still held up. I left early on a Thursday morning, taking a small highway that eventually narrowed to dirt roads and then to hiking trails. The car was full of everything I needed, and I had maps printed just in case I lost signal on my phone. Once I parked at the trailhead, I strapped on my backpack and started walking in. The air was fresh and smelled of pine and damp earth. The forest was dense, full of tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the air. The trail was well marked but not crowded. I found a nice spot to set up camp near a small creek that trickled gently through the rocks. It was about 3 miles from the trailhead, far enough to feel isolated but close enough to get back quickly if I needed. I cleared an area, pitched my tent, and gathered firewood. The day passed with me exploring the nearby woods, taking pictures of the wildflowers and watching a pair of deer drink from the creek. When night fell, I built a fire, cooked some dehydrated chili, and lay back on my sleeping pad, staring at the stars peeking through the gaps in the canopy. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. I woke early each morning to the sound of birds and the soft splash of the creek. I filled my water bottle, boiled water on my stove for coffee, and spent the days hiking along the trail, enjoying the solitude. It felt good to be away from noise and people. I was careful to keep the fire contained, to respect the wildlife, and to keep my campsite clean. On the 3rd night, something changed. The weather had turned cooler and wetter, with clouds rolling in from the west. I noticed that the forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Around dusk, while gathering firewood, I heard something. Faint footsteps, crunching leaves, a snap of a twig far off in the woods. I stopped and listened, but everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. After all, the forest was full of life. Back at camp, I secured my food in a bear-proof container I had brought. Even though I hadn't seen any signs of bears so far, I made a small fire and sat close, watching the flames. I felt the air grow colder and the wind pick up. Then I heard it again, footsteps, this time closer. Not the light step of an animal, but heavier, crunching through dead leaves and small branches. I looked into the dark forest beyond the firelight, but I could see nothing. I turned on my headlamp and shined it into the woods. The beam pierced the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. I waited quietly, holding my breath, hoping the sounds would stop. Instead, they grew louder and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a big branch breaking nearby. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my knife and stood up, shining the light around. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. The thought of someone else being out here, unannounced, made me uneasy. I had not seen another person since I arrived. I decided to pack up some of my food and my valuables, just in case, and put everything in my car. I also checked my phone, hoping for a signal to call someone, but there was none. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be a lost hunter or a hiker like me, but the forest felt different now, more oppressive. The isolation I had welcomed earlier suddenly felt like a trap. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire flickered. I stayed up most of the night, eyes scanning the darkness, ears straining for any noise. Every little sound made me jump. At one point, I heard something breathing heavy and uneven, somewhere just beyond the ring of firelight. I grabbed a rock and held it tight. As dawn approached, the noises stopped. The birds began to sing again, and the forest lightened. I lay back down, exhausted but unable to sleep well. The next day, I packed quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The woods seemed quieter, almost too quiet. I moved fast, feeling eyes on me but never seeing anyone. When I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I packed up everything and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest. Something about the whole experience stayed with me. A reminder that nature is beautiful but also unpredictable and sometimes dangerous because of other people, not the wilderness itself. The fear I felt was not from ghosts or monsters, but from the real and unknown threat of another human out there, watching, moving quietly in the dark woods. I realized then that sometimes the scariest things in the wild are not the animals or weather, but the unknown intentions of people. I kept camping later on, but I always made sure to let someone know exactly where I was going, to carry a whistle, and to trust my instincts more. That trip taught me a lot about respect for nature and caution about who or what might be sharing that space. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from my job in Missoula, Montana. I was 28 at the time, single, and tired of the constant pressure from work and everyday life. I wanted something quiet, away from people. No phone, no screens, just trees, fresh air, and time to think. I had always liked being outdoors, so I packed up my gear and drove west into the Bitterroot Mountains. I had a particular spot in mind that I'd found on a topographic map. It wasn't part of any official campground, just a clearing near an old logging trail deep in the forest, about 2 hours from the nearest paved road. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I just said I'd be out camping alone for a few days and left it at that. I figured if anything went wrong, I had my GPS, a paper map, and enough supplies to last me about a week. The drive took most of the day. By the time I turned off onto the gravel road that led deeper into the woods, the sun was already dropping. That road turned into a dirt trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. My old Tacoma handled it fine, though it was slow going. Trees crowded the path, and the occasional fallen branch scraped the undercarriage. I stopped a few times to clear the way with a hatchet. Eventually, I found the clearing I'd seen on the map. It was perfect, flat, surrounded by tall lodgepole pines, and bordered on one side by a small stream. I set up my tent just before dark, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal over the flame. It was peaceful. No sounds except the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle from the underbrush. I felt like I was finally alone in the way I needed to be. The first day passed quietly. I hiked around, collected firewood, and explored the immediate area. I marked my path with bits of orange tape so I wouldn't get turned around. The woods were thick, and it was easy to lose direction without landmarks. I didn't see any other people, which was exactly what I wanted. Just signs of old Forest Service activity, rusty metal stakes, a few collapsed wooden structures, maybe old tool sheds or cabins from decades ago. On the second morning, I woke up early. There was dew on the tent and the air was cold. I decided to hike further out, maybe follow the stream to see where it went. I packed a day bag with snacks, water, a knife, compass, map, and a flashlight, just in case. The stream wound its way east, so I followed it that direction for a few hours. The terrain was steeper than I expected. Lots of boulders, fallen trees, and places where the water disappeared under thick ferns and mossy rocks. I took a break around noon and sat on a log to eat. While resting, I noticed something odd a little ways off the path. It looked like a fence, just a piece of wire mesh strung between two trees. It was rusty and low, maybe only waist high. I walked over to check it out, curious. As I followed it with my eyes, I realized it kept going, running parallel to the slope, disappearing into thicker trees. It didn't make much sense to me. Who would put a fence all the way out here? It wasn't high enough to keep anything out or in, and it wasn't connected to anything else that I could see. I decided to follow it. After about 30 minutes of slow walking, ducking branches, and stepping over roots, I came across a narrow trail that looked more used than the one I'd been following. It wasn't marked on my map. It didn't look like any official Forest Service trail either. The dirt was packed down like someone had walked it recently. I hesitated, then turned onto it. It led uphill, and the higher I climbed, the more I saw signs that someone had been here. Fresh footprints, broken branches, and what looked like tire tracks from a cart or something narrow with wheels. After another 10 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. There was a structure, not quite a cabin, but more like a large shack. It was made from mismatched wood, some of it clearly salvaged from other buildings, with tarps stretched across the roof. I couldn't see any windows, just a heavy-looking door and a few plastic barrels lined up outside. To one side, there was a pile of animal bones. At least that's what I assumed they were. Some of them looked too big to be from deer, though. I saw skulls I didn't recognize. Maybe elk or something else. I didn't want to get closer to check. The whole place felt wrong. I didn't hear birds anymore. The air was still, and even though the sun was out, the clearing felt darker than it should have. I crouched down behind a fallen tree and watched for movement. I stayed there for almost an hour. No one came out, no sounds from inside, but I could see smoke coming from a small metal pipe poking out of the roof. Someone was definitely in there. I didn't want to be seen. I backed away slowly, keeping low, not stepping on anything that would snap or crack. I followed my steps exactly until I got back to the stream. Even then, I didn't relax. I hurried back to my camp, constantly checking over my shoulder, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside made me freeze. I kept thinking about that shack, about the bones, about what kind of person lived out here completely off-grid. I knew it wasn't illegal to live out in the woods, but something about that place felt off. The fence, the unmarked trail, the weird pile of bones. It wasn't just someone hiding out. It felt secretive. The next morning, I packed up. I was done. Whatever I came looking for, peace or space or whatever, I didn't want it anymore. I loaded everything back into the truck and started the slow drive back the way I came. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting someone to come running out of the woods. When I reached the gravel road again, I felt a little better. By the time I saw the first paved stretch of highway, it was like a weight had lifted. I stopped at a gas station in a town called Darby, bought a soda, and sat in the parking lot for a long time just watching people move around. It felt strange, like I had come back from a different world. I never reported what I found. Maybe I should have, but I didn't know what to say. I found a creepy shack with bones in the woods. There wasn't anything illegal about it that I could prove. And honestly, I just wanted to forget it, but I couldn't. A few weeks after I got home, I looked up old news stories from that part of the forest. I found a few vague articles about missing hunters, one from 2012 and another from 2014. Nothing ever solved. I checked maps again, trying to find that unmarked trail, but it didn't show up anywhere. Eventually, I let it go. I moved on with life, got a new job, moved to a different city. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never that deep into the woods. And I always tell someone exactly where I'm going. That place is probably still out there. That shack, that person. Whatever they're doing, they're still doing it, far away from where anyone would stumble onto it by accident. I just hope no one else does what I did. I hope no one else follows that fence, because whoever built it didn't want to be found. And I think I got lucky. I think I left just in time. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to the forests near Dead Horse Ridge in southern Montana. I was 27 at the time, working as a surveyor in Billings, and between long days of office work and staring at blueprints, I needed a break. I'd grown up around the outdoors, hunting and hiking with my dad, so I wasn't worried about being out there alone. That part of the state was quiet, and as far as I knew, not many people went into those woods once the air started to cool. I drove out on a Thursday morning with my old green Tacoma packed with gear, tent, food, water, my .38 revolver just in case, and enough camping supplies to last 4 or 5 days. The trailhead I picked was about an hour past a small town called Lodgepole, which itself was barely more than a few gas stations and a diner. The road leading to the forest entrance was gravel, full of dips and loose rocks, and by the time I parked at the edge of the trail, it was early afternoon and my arms were sore from gripping the wheel. There wasn't another car in sight, just miles of pine trees and low hills stretching into the distance. The sky was perfectly clear, bright blue, only a few small clouds floating by. I threw on my pack, locked up the truck, and started walking. The plan was to follow an unmarked game trail I'd read about on a hunting forum, According to the thread, it cut through thick woods for about 8 miles before opening into a clearing with a small creek nearby. That would be my base. The first few hours were peaceful. Just the sound of boots on pine needles, the occasional bird, and wind moving through the trees. I passed a few deer trails and an old, rusted-out tree stand that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The deeper I got, the more overgrown the trail became. At some point, I stopped seeing any markers at all and just followed what looked like a natural path between the trees. I figured I was still on the right track. By the time I reached the clearing, it was close to 6 in the evening. The place was better than I expected. A flat patch of earth surrounded by tall evergreens, with a gentle slope leading down to a slow-moving creek. The water looked clean. I dropped my pack, set up my tent on the dry side of the clearing, and got a small fire going. Dinner was a can of chili heated over the flame, and I washed it down with warm water from my bottle. I sat by the fire for a while, just listening to the woods. That first night, nothing strange happened. The second day was about exploring. I walked along the creek, followed a few game trails, found some elk droppings and tracks, and even spotted a fox darting between the trees. It was quiet out there, no planes, no people, no motors, just nature. I took a bunch of photos on my phone, mostly for myself, and went back to camp before the sun dipped too low. It was around then that I noticed something that felt off. There was a broken branch near my tent. Not just any branch. It looked like it had been twisted off from the trunk of a small pine about 30 feet away and jammed upright into the dirt about 10 feet from my tent. I stared at it for a good minute, trying to figure out if I had done it by accident or maybe stepped on something and caused it to fall weird. But the break was too clean. The pine tree was young, the branch wasn't rotten, and it looked like someone had snapped it in one move. That wasn't easy to do. I pulled it out of the dirt, tossed it aside, and told myself maybe a bear had come through, or some other animal. I hadn't seen any signs of bears, but I did hang my food up in a tree just to be safe. I slept lighter that night, one hand near my revolver, and woke up a few times thinking I heard movement outside the tent. Every time I stepped out to check, it was just wind or nothing at all. The third day, I planned a longer hike up a ridge on the other side of the creek. I packed some food, a map, and a compass, then left camp just after sunrise. The climb took a few hours. The view from the top was worth it. Endless forest, peaks in the distance, clouds rolling over the far hills. But on the way back down, I found something that made my stomach tighten. It was a tree, or what was left of one. A dead pine about 20 feet tall, and carved into its bark was a crude arrow pointing downward. Under the arrow were deep, horizontal gashes, 5 of them spaced evenly. They didn't look like claw marks. They looked cut, like someone had dragged a knife or a blade in a single stroke across the trunk. I looked around the base of the tree. No footprints, no tools, nothing. I didn't know what to make of it. I walked back to camp faster than I had the other days. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees behind me, just a flicker of something dark. But when I stopped and stared, everything was still. That night, I didn't start a fire. I ate a protein bar inside my tent, kept the flap half-zipped, and listened. The woods were louder, twigs snapping, rustling leaves, then long moments of silence, like something was watching. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up around 2 in the morning to a noise that still gives me chills thinking about it. It was a low, slow drag, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, maybe 20 feet from the tent. Then it stopped. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. Then again, the drag, a pause, the crunch of dry leaves. I grabbed the revolver, unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The fire pit was dark. My pack was where I left it. But there, at the edge of the trees, was a shape. Squat, human-sized, not moving. I watched it for what felt like 10 minutes. Then it turned. I didn't see a face, but I saw the motion. It twisted slightly, like someone shifting their shoulders. I aimed the gun, not to shoot, just to be ready. But then it just backed away, slowly, step by step, deeper into the trees until it vanished. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I stepped out and checked the area. There were drag marks, two wide trails through the pine needles, leading from the trees to about 15 feet from my tent. I followed them backward and found a pile of rocks. Just rocks. About 30 of them stacked into a small pyramid. None were bigger than a softball. They weren't there the day before. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed everything in under an hour, doused the fire pit with water even though it hadn't been lit, and didn't bother to eat. I had a GPS tracker clipped to my pack and used it to follow my path back toward the truck. The woods felt different, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Like everything had stopped moving. No birds, no squirrels, not even the wind. I was about 2 miles from the trailhead when I smelled it. Rot, strong, sharp like old meat or a dead animal left in the sun. It was coming from just off the trail. I stopped, pulled my shirt up over my nose, and stepped toward it. About 10 yards in, I saw it. A deer, or what was left of one. It had been gutted, but not like a hunter would. The stomach was sliced open wide, the guts pulled out and arranged in a line, leading away from the body. The head was missing, clean gone, not torn off, cut. The legs had been tied together with strips of bark, and its hide had been peeled halfway down its back. Couldn't look at it long. I turned around and moved faster. I made it to the truck just before noon. Everything was exactly as I left it. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I hit paved road again. I didn't look back once. When I got home, I took 3 showers, called in sick for 2 days, and didn't tell anyone what happened. Not even my dad. A week later, I checked that hunting forum. The post about the game trail was gone. Deleted. The user who posted it hadn't logged in since 2014. I sent a message to the admin but never got a reply. Since then, I haven't been camping alone. I still hike, still spend time in the woods, but always near people, always in places with marked trails and cell service. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was some strange hunter or a prank gone too far. But I know what I saw. I know the shape by my tent wasn't an animal. And I know something out there watched me for 2 days before I noticed. Whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. And it wanted me to leave. So I did. It was late September of 2022 when I decided to take a week off from everything and go camping alone. I had just turned 33, and life felt like it was dragging me around by the collar. I was burnt out from my job in tech support. My phone never stopped ringing, and I couldn't even remember the last time I had sat in silence without some notification buzzing. I figured it was time for something quiet, something off the grid. I live in Spokane, Washington, and after some research, I picked a spot about 2 hours north near Colville National Forest. It was deep in the woods, far from any of the usual hiking traffic, and I chose it because it had no cell service and no nearby campgrounds, just a wide, open area where I could park my car at the trailhead and hike in a few miles. I left on a Monday morning, just after sunrise. The sky was clear, the forecast was calm, and I packed everything carefully: tent, food, stove, knife, emergency whistle, bear spray, the usual. I even brought a paperback novel and my old sketch pad, thinking I'd have time to draw or read under the trees. It felt good to prepare for something that didn't involve Wi-Fi or a to-do list. The drive was peaceful. I took back roads most of the way, winding through small towns and thick forest, passing maybe 3 cars the whole time. Once I reached the gravel road that led to the trailhead, I stopped for a minute, shut off the engine, and just listened. Nothing but wind moving through trees. That was what I'd come for. I hiked in about 4.5 miles that first day. The trail wasn't well maintained, but it was marked with old wooden posts and faded orange ribbons tied to tree branches. It felt remote, untouched. After a few hours, I found a decent flat spot near a small stream, surrounded by tall fir trees. It was perfect. I pitched my tent, unpacked, and boiled some water for dinner. That first night, the air got colder than I expected. I had checked the weather, but I guess I underestimated how cold it could get in the forest at night, especially this late in the season. I layered up, crawled into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of the stream trickling nearby. It was one of the best nights of sleep I'd had in months. The next day, I woke up with the sun, sore but relaxed. I ate a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, packed a small bag with water and snacks, and decided to follow the stream upstream for a while, just to explore. I didn't see any signs of other people. No footprints, no trash, not even a broken twig that didn't look natural. Felt like I had the forest to myself. Around midday, I found a small clearing with some old stumps and what looked like the remains of a fire ring, but it was covered in moss and leaves. Probably hadn't been used in years. I sat down, sketched a little, then headed back to camp. When I got back, everything was as I left it. I made some coffee, read a bit, and settled in for another night. That night, I heard something. I'm not the type to scare easy, but around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft crunching sound outside my tent. At first I figured it was a deer, maybe an elk. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow and deliberate, not the kind of skittish noise deer usually make. I circled around the tent once, then again. I held my breath, clutching the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound faded. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I looked around for tracks. The ground was soft, a little damp from the stream, but I didn't see anything clear, just some bent grass and disturbed needles. Could have been anything. I shook it off, told myself it was probably just an animal curious about the smell of food. I spent the day closer to camp. I didn't feel like wandering too far after that night. I reorganized my pack, filtered more water, and kept my knife clipped to my belt. That afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. The position of my backpack had changed. I always hung it from a low branch to keep it off the ground. Now it was leaning against the tree instead. I told myself I must have knocked it down and forgotten. Still, it bothered me. That night, the forest felt heavier somehow. I could hear more than just the usual crickets and wind. I heard branches cracking in the distance. Once or twice, I thought I saw a flicker of light through the trees, like a reflection or maybe a small flashlight far off. I sat in the dark for a while, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But my instincts were starting to push back. The next morning, I decided I'd cut my trip short. I packed everything up carefully, triple-checked that I wasn't leaving any trash or gear behind. I started hiking out, following the same trail I came in on. But something was off. The orange ribbons that marked the trail were missing. Not all of them, just enough to make me second-guess my memory. The ones I did find looked like they'd been cut off clean, not torn or fallen. That made my stomach turn. I kept going, using the sun to orient myself and watching for any familiar landmarks. It was slow going. I didn't want to panic, but every sound in the woods felt louder, closer. At one point, I heard movement to my left, heavy footsteps, but they stopped the moment I turned. I crouched behind a fallen log, waited. Nothing. No birds, no wind, just silence. I stayed there for at least 10 minutes before I moved again. Every step after that felt like walking through a dream you want to wake up from. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat. My car was still there, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was halfway back to Spokane. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, back home, I was going through my backpack and found something strange wedged into the side pocket. A small piece of folded paper. I hadn't put it there. It was a page torn from a book, with faint writing in pencil on the blank side. It said, "Don't come back." I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting was shaky but human, real. I checked all my gear again. Everything else was accounted for. That paper, I don't know who left it or when, but it wasn't there when I packed for the trip. I reported what happened to the local forest office. They took down my statement, said they'd send someone to check the area, but I never heard back. I didn't press it. I haven't gone camping since. I've thought about that trip a lot. How quiet it was, how peaceful it started, and how fast that peace turned to something else. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hurt me, at least not right then. But they wanted me to know I wasn't alone, and that was enough. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters, but I believe in people. And I believe there are some people who live out in the woods, far from roads and rules, who don't want to be found. That's their right, but it's also a warning. I was lucky nothing worse happened. I still go hiking sometimes, but never that deep, and never alone. I've learned that the wilderness isn't just about beauty and quiet. Sometimes it's about knowing when to leave and listening when the forest whispers that it's time to go. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017 in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a remote area called Vermilion Ridge. I was 31 at the time, living in a small town called Petoskey. I had been doing solo trips on and off for a few years. I liked the silence, the solitude, being away from phone signals and emails. I worked as a mechanic in town and took a week off to get out into the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet reset. I had found a spot about 8 miles off a logging road, past a place called Mason Creek, where few people go. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing by a bend in the creek. There were old tracks from ATV tires and a blackened fire ring someone had used before. The woods were mostly pine and spruce, with thick undergrowth and narrow trails made by deer or the occasional hiker. I parked my truck along a dirt service road and hiked in with everything I needed for 5 nights. Food, water filter, tent, sleeping bag, axe, small stove, first aid kit, and my old 9mm pistol, which I carried more out of habit than fear. The first day was easy. I got to the clearing by mid-afternoon, set up camp, made a small fire, boiled water from the creek, and heated a can of chili. I walked the area in a slow loop before sunset to get a feel for the surroundings. I saw some animal tracks, mostly deer, one set that looked like coyote. Nothing unusual. That night, it was cool and quiet. I fell asleep listening to crickets and the distant sound of the creek sliding over rocks. On the second day, I spent most of my time fishing downstream with a small rod I'd packed. Caught a few brook trout, small ones, threw most back. I cooked one for dinner. That night it rained a little, but I had a good tent and stayed dry. The wind picked up around midnight, trees creaking, a few soft thuds of branches dropping nearby. I woke up twice, once to pee, once because I thought I heard something in the brush near the creek. Could have been a raccoon or a porcupine. I didn't think much of it. The third day was when things started to feel off. I woke up to find a deep shoe print in the mud about 30 feet from my tent. At first I thought it was mine. I'd walked around plenty, but it was bigger than my boot and pointed the wrong direction. I wear a size 10. This was at least a size 12 or 13. The tread pattern didn't match my boots either. It looked newer. The mud still held the shape clearly, so I figured it was made early that morning, maybe late at night. I scanned the woods around me and felt a knot tighten in my gut. No one should have been out here. It was miles from the nearest cabin, no signs of other campers, and no cars back at the road when I parked. I tried to explain it away, maybe an old track from someone weeks ago, and the rain had reshaped it, but it didn't sit right. I kept my gun closer the rest of the day and made sure I was more careful about my perimeter. I checked for more prints and didn't find any. I stayed close to camp, mostly. I didn't want to wander too far. That night, I didn't start a fire. I wanted the area dark, quiet. I laid in my sleeping bag with my headlamp off, the gun next to me, just listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard branches snapping, slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the underbrush. Not an animal crash, not a squirrel or a deer, something heavier, but trying to stay quiet. I held my breath. It moved closer, then stopped. I was lying on my side, barely daring to blink. The sound didn't come back. I stayed frozen until dawn started to light the sky. When I got out of the tent, I looked around again. No new tracks, no sign of a visitor. But I noticed a broken branch about shoulder high on a pine tree, right where the sound had come from. It was snapped clean, green with still wet where it had been twisted. I didn't know if that meant anything, but I didn't like it. I started thinking maybe I should leave, but I hated the idea of being scared off by something I couldn't even prove. Still, I packed my things just in case, putting the sleeping bag and most of my gear back in my pack, leaving only the stove and some food out. I told myself I'd wait one more night and leave first thing in the morning if nothing else happened. The fourth night, I built a fire again, trying to make things feel normal. I forced myself to eat, but I was jumpy. I kept checking over my shoulder, flashlight in hand. Before I went to bed, I moved my tent a little closer to the creek and set up a few makeshift noise traps, just fishing line tied between trees with a few cans hanging from them. Crude, but I figured if something walked through, I'd hear it. I didn't sleep, not even close. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard the faintest sound, metal clinking. My chest went tight. I waited, hearing nothing else, then a second clink, followed by the softest rattle of something brushing against one of the cans. I sat up slowly, pistol in hand, trying not to breathe too loudly. I unzipped the tent just an inch and peeked out. There was someone standing by the old fire ring. No flashlight, no headlamp, just standing there, barely visible in the low light. I could only make out the outline, a tall shape still as a stone. My skin went cold. He didn't move. He didn't seem to be looking around, just standing. I stayed frozen, unsure if he could see me or not. After what felt like 10 minutes, he turned and walked slowly back into the woods, disappearing into the dark. I waited another hour before I got out of the tent. I didn't even pack everything. I just grabbed the essentials, threw them into the pack, and left the rest behind: tent, stove, sleeping pad. I hiked out with a flashlight in one hand and my pistol in the other, following the trail back to the logging road as the sky started to lighten. My truck was untouched. No one had slashed the tires or messed with it. I threw the pack in and drove without stopping until I reached the next gas station nearly 2 hours away. I sat there for a while before I could even pump gas. My hands were still shaking. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe someone who wandered off a different trail and found my camp by accident. But that didn't explain the way he stood there. The silence, the fact that he was out there at nearly 3 in the morning without a light, without saying anything, and just vanished back into the woods. I never reported it. What would I say? That some guy walked near my tent and didn't speak? That I found a boot print? No crime was committed. Nothing was stolen. But something about it felt wrong in a way I still can't fully explain. I haven't been camping alone since then. I still go hiking, still fish, but I stay in places where I can see other people, where there's cell service, where help isn't 8 miles away through dense forest. I've had friends tell me I should give solo trips another try, but they weren't there. They didn't see him. They didn't hear those quiet footsteps in the middle of the night. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, or if I had called out, or if I'd stepped out of the tent and confronted him. But I didn't. I stayed quiet. I watched, and I left. That's what saved me, because whatever that man was doing out there, I don't think he was lost. I don't think he stumbled onto my camp by mistake. I think he knew I was there, and I think he wanted me to know that too. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a week off from my IT job and go camping alone. It was the middle of September 2023, and I needed a break from the noise, screens, and the stress that built up after months of constant work. I picked a place in southern Oregon called Hartley Ridge, a quiet, forested area about 3 hours outside of Grants Pass. It wasn't an official campground, just a few dirt clearings spread out along a narrow gravel road that climbed through thick pine forests. I'd been there once before with some friends a couple of years ago. We had a decent time, fishing, hiking, drinking too much. This time I was going alone. I needed the silence, the disconnect. I didn't bring any music or books, just basic gear, enough food, my tent, a propane burner, and a cooler of drinks. I parked at the end of the gravel road and hiked a few minutes off the path to find a spot that was hidden enough I wouldn't see or hear anyone if they happened to be in the area. The weather was good, cool but not cold during the day, and it dipped into the low 40s at night. I set up camp near a large boulder that faced a steep hill covered in fir trees and moss. There was a little stream about 30 yards away that kept a steady trickle of water sounds running in the background. That first day, I just took it slow, made a small fire, ate canned chili, stared at the trees. The sun dropped behind the ridge around 6, and I was in bed by 8, the kind of tired you feel in your bones. The second day was similar. I explored some of the animal trails that cut through the woods around my campsite. They weren't made by people. just narrow tracks animals use, weaving between tree roots and stumps. I followed one that curved up the ridge and disappeared into the thickest part of the forest. I didn't go too far, just far enough to lose sight of my camp and feel that moment of panic before turning around. I spent the evening chopping dead branches, stacking them neatly, then boiling instant noodles. But on the third night, things changed. It started with the wind, picked up around midnight. My tent flapped hard enough to wake me. I sat up, groggy, not scared, just irritated. I figured it was a passing gust, but it didn't stop. It kept whipping through the trees, bending them so they creaked and moaned. I laid back down but couldn't sleep. Then I heard something that wasn't the wind. At first, I thought it was just a branch cracking. That happens a lot in the woods. But this was different. It was rhythmic, crunching leaves, slow, spaced out, like footsteps. I lay perfectly still, breathing shallow, eyes wide open in the dark. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. The steps circled my tent once, slow and deliberate, and then stopped. Not like someone walking by, more like someone standing still. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I waited. Every second felt like a minute. Finally, after what had to be 10 full minutes, I heard the crunching start again, but this time it moved away, back into the trees. I stayed awake until the first light. In the morning, I didn't see anything strange. No footprints, but that wasn't surprising. The forest floor was covered in needles and soft dirt. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer, maybe an elk, but the steps had been too slow, too controlled, not animal-like. Still, I stayed. I'd driven too far to leave over one bad night. That afternoon, I hiked back up the ridge trail I'd explored earlier. I tried to shake the unease in my gut by forcing myself to move, to sweat. But halfway up the hill, I noticed something odd. A strip of bark on a large pine had been stripped clean, high up, like 7 or 8 feet off the ground. Not scraped like an animal would do, peeled, torn down the trunk in a wide, clean line. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My skin prickled with unease. I took a different path back down. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I laid there in my tent, fully dressed, flashlight in hand. I didn't hear anything strange, but the silence was worse. I didn't hear owls, no bugs, no wind, just nothing. I sat outside by the fire until it burned low, listening to every sound in the trees, real or imagined. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed up slowly, telling myself it was the right decision even if I couldn't explain exactly why. I didn't feel safe. I had a knife on me, but it was small. Useless, really. I was just stuffing the last things into my backpack when I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a stack of rocks near my fire pit. 5 of them, different sizes, balanced carefully, one on top of the other. I hadn't built it. I never stack rocks. It wasn't there the night before. Someone had to have come into my camp while I slept, or while I was hiking, and left it there. I felt my legs go cold. Not from fear exactly, from realization. This wasn't just bad luck or nerves. Someone was messing with me, watching me. I looked around, scanning the tree line for any movement. Nothing, just stillness. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I threw everything into my pack, stomped out the fire, and started hiking back to my car. It was just under a mile, but I made it feel longer by stopping every few minutes to listen. I kept expecting to hear someone behind me, but there was nothing. When I got back to the gravel road, I was relieved. I thought I was in the clear. My car was parked at the end, just visible through the trees. That's when I saw the back window. It had been smashed. Not with a rock or a bat, just punched through like someone wanted to reach in. The glass was still there, scattered across the back seat and the ground. But nothing was taken. My emergency box, a few tools, some old clothes, all untouched. The door was still locked. They hadn't opened it, just shattered the window and left it. I didn't waste time. I got in, turned the key, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I finally reached Grants Pass, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, engine running, trying to process what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. I kept the blinds closed. The police didn't care when I called to report it. They told me it was probably a vagrant or bored teenagers. Maybe, but teenagers don't move silently through the woods, circle your tent, and build stacks of rocks. I haven't been camping alone since. It's been almost 2 years now. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I go with other people now, and I never go back to the same spot twice. Sometimes I wake up from dreams where I'm back in that tent, listening to footsteps in the dark. That stack of rocks is what sticks with me the most. It didn't belong there. It wasn't an accident. It was placed there by someone who wanted me to know they'd been close. Close enough to watch me sleep. Close enough to walk into my camp and leave something behind without being heard. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know they were real, and that's what scares me the most. Not what I imagined, not what I dreamed, but what actually happened. Because in the woods, there's no locked door, no streetlights, no neighbors, just you, the trees, and whoever else might be out there watching, waiting, and sometimes they're not afraid to get close. I was 33 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Stanislaus National Forest in California. It was late September 2018, just after the summer crowds had died down but before the real cold set in. I worked a quiet IT job in Sacramento and had just gone through a long breakup, so I needed something that felt completely disconnected from everything. I'd done a few solo overnights before, but this time I wanted more. I planned 4 nights out there, alone, with no phone signal and nobody expecting to hear from me. That kind of silence was exactly what I thought I needed. I picked a spot deep off the main forest roads, about an hour of driving past any paved section. I used a topo map and GPS to find a clearing a couple miles from a small, unnamed stream. No trails led there directly, it was all off the beaten path. I parked the car at the end of a narrow dirt spur that barely looked drivable and hiked in just before dusk. My pack loaded with food, water, bear canister, tent, sleeping bag, and a small camp stove. I brought a hatchet, a fixed blade knife, and bear spray just in case. Everything was packed tight and balanced. I was used to being careful. By the time I got to the clearing, the sun was low. The light coming through the trees looked like gold, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. I set up my tent at the edge of the trees, where the ground was flat and clear. The forest was quiet except for the occasional distant bird or rustle of wind in the pine needles. I made a quick dinner of beans and rice on my stove, brushed my teeth well away from camp, hoisted my bear canister into a nearby tree using paracord, and climbed into my sleeping bag by 9 p.m. I read for a while by headlamp, then let the silence settle over me like a blanket. The first night was peaceful, cold but peaceful. I woke up a couple times to the sound of branches creaking, but that's normal in the woods. You get used to the way everything sounds alive. When morning came, it was crisp and blue and completely still. I made coffee and oatmeal, walked to the stream with my water filter, and refilled my bottles. I followed the water uphill for about a mile just to explore, keeping mental notes of landmarks. I didn't bring a GPS tracker because I'd practiced orienteering for years and always carried a compass and map. Around midday, I returned to camp and spent most of the afternoon reading, sharpening my knife, and gathering fallen wood. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was asleep when a sound pulled me awake. Branches breaking, not just creaking in the wind, but snapping under weight. I froze inside my sleeping bag and held my breath, listening hard. It was close, maybe 30 yards from the tent. Whatever it was, it moved slowly. A few steps, then a pause, then more movement. I stayed still, ears straining. No heavy breathing, no grunting. Just the soft crunch of pine needles and the occasional break of a twig. I waited nearly an hour before the sounds stopped completely. In the morning, I checked the area around camp. No tracks, no signs of an animal or person. The pine needles were thick, and unless something had stomped directly in the mud, there wouldn't be footprints. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or elk passing through, though I knew the sounds didn't quite match that. It had sounded too deliberate, too slow, like something trying not to be noticed. Still, I didn't want to psych myself out. I had 3 days left. I boiled water for coffee, forced myself to eat, and hiked farther upstream, this time with more focus on mapping the area. I brought my knife in my belt and kept checking over my shoulder. Nothing seemed unusual, but the silence felt heavier. The forest no longer felt still in a peaceful way. It felt like something was holding its breath. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in my bag, listening. Around midnight, the same slow movement returned. This time, it was closer. I heard a stick crack so loud I jolted upright. I grabbed my knife and waited. No flashlight, no sound from me. Just breathing through my nose and trying to stay quiet. I swear I heard breathing outside. Very faint. Something brushed against the tent wall. A small, slow movement. Then nothing. Absolute silence for hours. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Still no footprints. But something was off with the bear canister. It was about 5 feet from the tree where I'd hung it. Still sealed, but lying sideways. The rope was untied. Not chewed or torn, untied. Clean, not work, completely undone. I packed up my stove, grabbed my knife and compass, and hiked a wide loop around camp, looking for any signs of a person. Nothing. No wrappers, no boot prints, no cut branches. But when I came back to the clearing, something had changed. My hatchet was stuck in the tree next to my tent. I hadn't left it there. I'd left it under the tarp, wrapped in a cloth. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Someone was there while I was gone. I took down my tent immediately and packed everything. I planned to hike straight back to the car, but my gut said not to go the same way I came. If someone had found me, maybe they were waiting. I made a wide arc southeast, toward a logging road I remembered from the map. It would take longer, maybe a full day, but it felt safer. The hike was rough. The terrain was uneven, and I was off trail the whole time. Around midday, I stopped to rest and eat a granola bar. That's when I heard it again, movement in the trees. I stood still and listened. Same slow steps, same rhythm. This time I saw something. Not clearly, just a shadow maybe 30 yards behind me. I ducked and watched. No movement. I stayed crouched for 10 minutes before moving again, this time even slower and more carefully. I didn't stop again, just kept walking. I reached the logging road just before sunset. It was barely more than a pair of old tire ruts, but it meant I could follow it toward a ranger station marked on my map. I didn't plan to stop until I saw a building or a vehicle. I hiked with my flashlight out, battery half drained, jumping at every sound. The trees felt too close. The dark came fast. Around 10 p.m., I heard a vehicle. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder. An engine coming from behind me. I stepped off the road and hid behind a tree. A truck rolled past slowly. An old, beat-up Ford. No lights, just rolling on its own momentum. I didn't see the driver clearly, but there was someone in it, slouched low, wearing a cap. I waited until the sound faded completely, then sprinted in the opposite direction. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I collapsed off the road in a patch of brush and waited for morning. The first light, I walked fast. Didn't run, just kept moving. Around 11 a.m., I found the ranger station. It was old and looked abandoned, but there was a satellite radio on a small desk inside. I turned it on and called for help, voice shaking. Took almost an hour for someone to respond. They sent a Forest Service truck to meet me. When they arrived, I broke down for the first time. Told them everything. The sounds, the hatchet, the truck. They didn't say much, just nodded and asked me to mark on the map where I'd been. One ranger, an older guy with a gray beard, gave me a long look and said I wasn't the first person to come out of those woods shaken. He didn't explain. I never went back. I sold all my gear, stopped camping alone. I still hike, but only on busy trails, only with friends. That silence I'd wanted, I got it. And something else I never asked for. Something that watched from the trees and knew exactly how to stay hidden. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't a ghost either. It was just a person. A real person living in those woods. Someone who knew how to track, how to stay quiet, how to unsettle you without ever saying a word. And I'll never understand why they didn't do more than they did. Why they didn't take the canister. Why they didn't take me. But I know this much. They were there. They saw me. They watched everything. And they wanted me to know it. In the fall of 2017, I rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota, a few miles outside a town called Carlton. I was 39 at the time, living in Minneapolis, and after a long year of dealing with people, clients, coworkers, neighbors, I needed quiet. My job at a logistics company had worn me down. I'd saved up enough vacation days for a solid 2-week break and decided to get as far from the city as I could without crossing state lines. I didn't want beaches or resorts or anything fancy. I just wanted a place where I could sit with my thoughts, go hiking, cook some simple food, and sleep without car horns or sirens outside my window. The cabin I found online looked perfect. It sat on the edge of a thick patch of forest near the southern tip of Black Lake. The pictures showed an old structure made of weathered cedar with a stone chimney and a narrow dock stretching out into the water. The listing described it as a rustic one-bedroom with a kitchen, a small living room, a screened porch, and a wood-burning stove. No TV, no Wi-Fi. The owner, an older guy named Dale who lived in town, left the keys in a lockbox on the back door. I arrived in early October. The air smelled like damp pine needles, and the trees were in that in-between stage, half green, half gold. The gravel road leading to the property was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for one car. The last stretch was rough, and I had to slow down to avoid scraping the underside of my Honda. When I pulled up, the place looked even more remote than I expected. The nearest cabin was at least a quarter-mile away, maybe more, and there wasn't a single sound around me except the faint rustle of trees. Inside, it was simple but clean. One bedroom with a double bed and a metal frame window looking out at the trees. A small kitchen with an old gas stove and a fridge that buzzed quietly. The bathroom was surprisingly modern with decent plumbing. The living room had a sagging brown couch, a faded rug, and a couple of wooden chairs near the stove. There was a shelf with a few paperbacks, mostly thrillers and some beat-up old guidebooks. Everything smelled like cedar and dust. The first 3 days were great. I went for long hikes in the woods, usually following an overgrown path behind the cabin that curved toward the lake and then looped back through a patch of dense pine. I cooked simple meals, eggs in the morning, canned soup or sandwiches for lunch, pasta or fish for dinner. I'd sit on the dock in the evenings, listening to the loons on the lake and watching the sky darken. The nights were cold, but the stove worked well. I chopped some wood using the old hatchet I found by the shed and kept a small fire going most nights. I didn't bring much, just a couple of bags, a flashlight, a book, and a notebook. I didn't even bother with my phone most days. It was on the 4th night that things started feeling strange. I'd gone to bed early, around 9:30. I remember waking up suddenly sometime after midnight. I wasn't sure why, but something had pulled me out of sleep. The room was dark except for a bit of moonlight coming through the window. I lay there, eyes open, trying to listen. There wasn't much, just the creaking of the cabin, maybe a breeze outside. I turned over and tried to fall back asleep. It took longer than usual. The next morning, I went out to the shed to grab more firewood. As I stepped around the side of the cabin, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boots. They were faint but definitely human. At first, I told myself they must have been mine from earlier in the week, maybe when I checked around the property. But I walked those steps in my head and realized I hadn't gone near that side. Not since the day I arrived. The prints went from the edge of the woods toward the back porch, then doubled back. They looked recent. The ground was soft from rain 2 nights ago, and these hadn't washed away. I checked the lockbox, still closed. Back door still locked. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had wandered too close. A hunter, maybe. Still, I walked the perimeter of the cabin just to be sure. Nothing else seemed off. That night, I slept lightly. Every little sound snapped me awake. The wind brushing tree branches, the creak of the porch, even the shift of the cooling stove. Around 2 a.m., I heard a definite sound. A short, dry crunch outside, like someone stepping on dead leaves. I sat up slowly, heart beating hard. I stayed completely still for a minute, listening. Another soft crunch, then nothing. I got up and moved to the window. I couldn't see much, just black trees and a bit of moonlight over the lake. I didn't see anyone. The next day, I found more tracks. These ones came from the opposite direction, from the far side of the trees behind the shed. They stopped about 10 feet from the cabin. I felt something shift in me then, a subtle fear, like the edge of something I didn't want to see. I didn't have binoculars, but I used my phone's camera zoom to scan the woods from the back porch. Nothing moved. I didn't see tents, smoke, or flashlights. I told myself maybe it was just some local, curious, maybe a little nosy. But that didn't explain why they came at night or why they didn't knock or call out. I didn't sleep much that night either. I kept a hatchet by the bed. The stove burned low. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock. One knock, sharp and deliberate, on the side of the cabin near the living room. I sat up in the dark, frozen. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. No footsteps, no other sounds, just that one deliberate knock. I didn't look out the window this time. I waited until the sky began to lighten before I got up. I spent the whole next day on edge. Every sound made me flinch. I debated packing up and leaving, but something about that felt like giving in. I wasn't hurt. The place hadn't been broken into. I didn't want to run from shadows. Still, I kept the fire going during the day, more to feel less alone than for warmth. On the 7th day, I woke up to find something nailed to a tree about 20 feet from the cabin. It was a piece of cardboard. At first, I thought it was trash, but it was pinned up with a rusted nail. I got closer and saw a jagged hole in the middle, like it had been torn or stabbed through. No writing, no marks, just a ripped piece of cardboard nailed to a tree, facing the cabin. It was so specific and weird I didn't know how to react. It didn't feel random, felt like a message. I yanked it down and tossed it into the fire. I made the decision then to leave early. I packed up that afternoon, locked everything, and started driving out. About halfway down the gravel road, I stopped the car and stepped out. I stood still for a minute and listened. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. Not just visiting the cabin, but watching from the woods. Following, maybe, waiting. It wasn't paranoia. It was something in my gut that kept tightening each day I stayed. Back in Minneapolis, I didn't tell anyone much about it. A few coworkers asked how the cabin was, and I just said it was quiet. I didn't go into detail. What could I say? That someone knocked on my wall at 3 in the morning and left weird cardboard signs in the woods? That I found boot prints around the place without any explanation? I didn't have photos or proof. Just memories and a knot in my stomach that didn't ease up for weeks. About a month later, I got a call from a private number. I didn't answer it. No message was left. Then it happened again a few days later. I finally picked up the 3rd time, but there was nothing. Just silence and a faint clicking sound, like wind on a microphone. I hung up. It never happened again. I didn't go back to any cabin for the next few years. I stuck to hotels. I told myself maybe it had been some local messing around. Maybe even some kid. But deep down, I don't think that's it. Whoever it was didn't want to scare me off right away. They wanted to watch me, to get close. It wasn't about stealing anything or hurting me, at least not at first. It felt like a slow game, the kind where you don't even realize you're part of it until you're too far in. Looking back, I think leaving early was the right call. If I'd stayed longer, maybe they would have tried to come inside. Maybe they were just waiting for me to let my guard down. Maybe they would have knocked again, only harder. Or maybe they'd stop knocking entirely. Just walk in. I still think about that place sometimes. I even looked up the cabin listing again the next year. It was gone, taken off the rental site. No forwarding link, nothing. I searched the address, but all I found was a plot of land listed as vacant. No mention of the cabin. It's like it never existed, but I know it did. I still dream about it sometimes. The quiet lake, the crunch of leaves, and that single knock in the night that broke everything. It was the fall of 2017, and I was 31 years old. My name's Kevin Dobson, and back then, I worked as a freelance industrial designer based out of Columbus, Ohio. Work had been steady for most of the year, and I'd saved up enough to take a couple weeks off before winter really set in. I didn't want anything fancy, no cities, no long flights, just some quiet place where I could get away from people, clear my head, and maybe even sketch a little if I felt like it. I found this old cabin listed on a rental site, tucked away deep in the Allegheny National Forest, Pennsylvania. The listing was bare bones, just a few photos, no reviews, but it showed a small, single-room wooden cabin beside a narrow stream. The trees were already golden and orange in the photos. It looked perfect. The guy who posted it left a short note about it being rustic, off-grid, and better suited for those wanting full solitude. I booked it for 9 days straight. I packed light, mostly warm clothes, my thick boots, a portable camping stove, a cooler with enough dry food and perishables, a large flashlight, some basic tools, my sketch pad, and a couple spare battery packs for my phone. There was no service out there, which I expected. That was fine. I brought a topographic map printed from Google Earth and a compass just in case. The drive from Columbus took just under 6 hours. Once I passed Warren, the roads thinned out, and signs became few and far between. After about 20 minutes on a gravel logging road, I reached the end of a narrow trail. There was a rusty chain across it and a small wooden sign nailed to a tree, "Cabin Trail Private." That was it. I parked my car just off the shoulder, pulled on my pack, and followed the trail by foot. Took about 45 minutes to hike in. The trail was uneven and mostly covered in dead leaves. I didn't see anyone, not even a squirrel. Eventually, the trees opened a bit and I spotted the roof of the cabin peeking over some brush. It sat on a slight incline next to a stream, just like in the photos. The place looked weathered but solid: log walls, a metal roof, and one small chimney. There was no sign of recent activity. A narrow wooden porch ran across the front with a single rocking chair and a dry stack of firewood leaning against the side. The door wasn't locked. Inside, it was one room. A cot, a wood stove, a tiny table with 2 mismatched chairs, and some cabinets against the far wall. There was a rusty pump sink next to a sealed-off pipe. Must have been for collecting rainwater or gray water, but it didn't work. No fridge, no bathroom, just a chemical toilet in a shed about 30 feet behind the cabin. The silence was deep. I could hear the stream, some birds in the trees, and the occasional rustle from falling leaves. No engines, no people. I loved it. I settled in quick. That first day I unpacked, swept out the dust, and chopped a few logs just for the rhythm of it. I made a simple dinner, read for a bit, and went to bed early. That night I slept like a stone, the wood stove keeping the place warm. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked in the mornings and spent the afternoons sketching the trees, the shape of the hills, the way the light filtered through the canopy. On the third day, it rained steadily, so I stayed inside and worked on designs for a chair I had in mind. Nothing unusual happened. The only odd thing I noticed was a faint, rotting smell near the back of the cabin. I figured it was some small animal that died under the floor or in the shed. I didn't investigate. By day 5, I noticed something strange. That morning, I found a boot print in the mud near the stream. It wasn't mine. It was broader, maybe a size 12, and the tread was different, looked like heavy-duty hiking boots. I thought maybe someone had passed through while I was asleep. Not unheard of, even way out here. Still, I kept my pocket knife in my jacket the rest of the day, just in case. The next night, I was up late reading by the light of my lantern when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. 2 quick thuds on the porch boards. I froze. I turned the light off and sat still, my ears straining. The cabin was dark except for a faint glow from the embers in the stove. The sound didn't repeat. I stayed sitting for what felt like an hour, heart beating in my ears. Nothing. The next morning, I checked the porch. No prints, no scuff marks, just leaves and dust. I convinced myself it had been a branch falling or an animal, maybe a raccoon. That afternoon, I hiked out half a mile to where the stream widened a little, trying to clear my head. I followed the edge of the water, hoping to spot wildlife or interesting rocks. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. On a flat stone near the water was a small pile of stacked twigs, arranged neatly, like a tiny teepee. Around it were 3 ringed stones, almost like a miniature campfire. It was too clean to be natural. It looked deliberate, like someone made it recently. I didn't touch it. I backed away and went straight back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep much. On the 7th day, it got worse. That morning, I woke up to find the cabin's door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. There was an old sliding bolt I used each night, and I remembered clearly sliding it before bed. But now it was off the latch. Nothing inside was taken or moved. At least nothing obvious. The cooler was still closed. My tools were where I left them. Still, it rattled me. I checked my pack, my phone, everything. All still there. I was fully alone, but I didn't feel alone anymore. That afternoon, I searched the area thoroughly. I walked circles around the cabin, checked the trail, the woods behind the shed, even climbed a tree to get a better view. Nothing, just trees and silence. That night, I stayed awake in the rocking chair with my flashlight in hand and my pocket knife within reach. At one point, around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the faint sound of something being dragged, slow, crunching movement through leaves, coming from uphill behind the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't shine the light. I just waited. It stopped after a few minutes. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found something on the porch. It was a dead bird, some kind of thrush or finch. Its neck was twisted, wings spread out unnaturally. It had been placed carefully, centered right in front of the door. That was it for me. I packed everything I could into my backpack, slammed the bolt shut behind me, and started the hike back to the car. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I needed to get out. When I reached the spot where the trail met the logging road, I stopped cold again. My car was still there, but the rear window had been smashed in. Not shattered, smashed. Glass all over the seat. Someone had used something heavy. A rock or pipe, maybe. Nothing was stolen that I could tell. My glove box had been opened, the papers scattered, but nothing else taken. I cleaned out the glass as best I could and drove back to Warren with the cold air whipping through the broken window. I told the rental site the cabin was unsafe and left a detailed report. I didn't hear back. They removed the listing 2 weeks later. Back in Columbus, I had trouble sleeping for a long time. I kept thinking about that sound in the night, the tiny twig structure by the stream, the boot print, the dead bird. It wasn't one thing that scared me, it was the buildup. The signs that someone had been watching me, not rushing in or doing anything dramatic, just watching, getting closer each day. I never saw a face. I never heard a voice, but someone was out there, and they wanted me to know it. I still go camping now, but only with friends, never alone, and never anywhere that quiet again. I was 34 the summer I decided to take a break from everything. My name's Travis, and back then I was working in a metal fabrication plant in Omaha, Nebraska. I'd been at it for 11 years. Long shifts, rotating weekends, no room to breathe. One afternoon in June 2023, something in me snapped. I drove home from work soaked in sweat, took one look at myself in the mirror, and decided I needed to disappear for a bit. Not forever, just long enough to clear my head. I didn't want to fly, and I didn't want to be near people. So I went online and searched for remote cabins for rent within driving distance. I ended up booking a small off-grid place in the western part of Montana, somewhere near Libby. The listing was buried deep on a forum, not a big site. No reviews, but it looked clean. Said it was built in the early 90s, had a wood stove, running water from a gravity-fed tank, a generator for a couple of lights, and no cell signal for miles. That was perfect. I packed my truck with everything I thought I'd need. Non-perishables, a cooler with ice, a sleeping bag, basic tools, fishing gear, a shotgun I never really used, just in case. Took me 2 days to drive up. I stopped in Missoula for supplies, then another 3 hours north. The road started thinning out, gas stations got further apart, and by the time I hit Libby, I already felt the weight coming off my shoulders. To get to the cabin, I had to drive another 20 miles on dirt roads that twisted up into the mountains. It was evening when I finally found the place. The cabin was tucked in a clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, with a tiny creek flowing about 30 feet behind it. No neighbors, no cars, no signs of life, just a small shed, a propane tank, and a hand-painted sign nailed to the porch that said, Spruce Hollow. Inside, the place was simple: wood walls, a cot with a thin mattress, a counter with a camp stove, some open shelves with cookware, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a desk by the window with an old oil lamp and a folding chair. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a bucket shower setup. Nothing fancy, but it was clean. I unpacked, lit a lantern, and heated up some canned chili. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to do anything or answer to anyone. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I read a little, hiked around the property, fished in the creek, caught a few small ones. I kept a little journal, mostly to remind myself why I came out here. Each morning, I chopped wood for the stove, boiled water for coffee, and sat on the porch for hours. The air was clean, and the only sound was the wind in the trees and the water in the creek. It was around the fourth day when things started to feel off. I woke up one morning to find the front door cracked open. I was sure I'd latched it the night before. There was no wind, and the cabin didn't have a warped frame or anything like that. I looked around, checked the windows. Everything was shut. Nothing was missing. I told myself I'd probably just been tired and forgot to secure the door. That afternoon, I hiked up the ridge behind the cabin, hoping to get a better view of the area. It was steep and thick with undergrowth, but I made it to a small clearing. From there, I could see the cabin below through the trees. I sat for a while, drank some water, and was just about to head back when I noticed something strange in the dirt near where I'd set my pack. A footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, pressed into a patch of soft soil. Bigger than mine, maybe a size 13 boot, and deeper, like the person had some weight on them. I looked around, but I didn't hear anything. Still, I felt watched. I didn't run, but I packed up quick and made my way back down. When I got back to the cabin, I checked everything again. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I put a chair under the doorknob and set a small cooking pot on top so I'd hear if someone tried to come in. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sharp clang. The pot had fallen. My heart slammed against my chest. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight and my shotgun, and listened. Nothing. I checked the door. It was still closed, but the chair had moved a little. Not a lot, but enough to notice. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up with the light on, the shotgun across my lap. When the sun came up, I stepped outside, scanned the clearing, and walked the perimeter. I found more footprints, this time behind the cabin near the creek. Same size, same direction, like someone had circled around. I followed them for a while, but lost them where the pine needles got thick. I didn't leave right away. I should have, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. Another part told me maybe it was just a hunter passing through. But by the next night, I couldn't ignore it. I'd just gotten into bed when I heard it. Movement outside. Not an animal. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path that led from the shed to the porch. I turned off the lantern, crept to the window, and waited. Took a full minute, but then I saw him. A man standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, barely visible. He wasn't wearing a backpack or carrying anything obvious, just dark clothes and heavy boots. He stood there, perfectly still, like he was listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After maybe 2 minutes, he turned and walked away. Slow and quiet, like he knew I was watching but didn't care. That was it. The next morning, I packed up everything I could fit into the truck. I left some gear behind, my folding chair, a few cooking things, even some food. I didn't want to be out there any longer than I had to. When I got to town, I found the closest ranger station and told them what happened. They sent a guy up to check it out, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no damage, nothing. Just footprints, which they said could have been mine. I knew better. I didn't go back for the rest of my gear. I didn't care. When I got home, I changed all my locks, bought motion lights, and started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed. I didn't tell many people what happened. Most wouldn't get it. They'd say I imagined it or I overreacted. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there. And the worst part is not knowing why. He didn't try to rob me. He didn't break anything. He just watched. Came close enough to open a door, knock a pan down, stand where I could almost see him. That kind of quiet, patient behavior, it's not normal. It's not something you forget. I still love the idea of being out in the woods, but I'll never go alone again. Not like that. Not without a second vehicle, a radio, or at least someone who'd notice if I didn't come back. Some people think danger always comes loud, with shouting, gunshots, or chaos. But sometimes danger comes quiet, with slow steps in the dark, and someone standing just out of reach, just waiting. And that's what stays with you the longest. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 years old then, working as a junior editor in a publishing house, the kind of job where days blended into each other without much change. The idea of a quiet week away from the noise, people, and constant stress seemed like a perfect way to clear my head. I found the cabin through a small ad in a local magazine. An old man named Henry rented it out during the off-season, promising solitude and peace. I wanted just that, peace. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, tucked far back on a narrow dirt road that wound its way through thick pine forests and rocky hills. The trees were already changing colors, their leaves burnt orange, yellow, and red, falling softly in the cool breeze. When I arrived, the sun was just dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows that made the woods look darker than they should have been for that hour. The air smelled clean, with a faint hint of damp earth and pine sap. The cabin itself was small, maybe 600 square feet, with a single room that had a stone fireplace, a little kitchen corner, and a narrow loft for sleeping. The woods smelled old but not rotten, and the windows were dusty but clear enough to see outside. It had the kind of worn charm that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. There was no electricity, no phone line, and certainly no internet. It was all part of the appeal, an escape from everything. That first night, after setting down my bags and lighting a fire, I sat quietly, listening to the crackling logs and the strange, distant sounds of the forest. Somewhere, a bird called out, maybe a barred owl, and the wind whispered through the trees. The cabin felt safe, but also isolated in a way I hadn't expected. I slept well, waking only once to the cold air sneaking in through a gap in the window frame. The next morning, I explored the small area around the cabin. There was a narrow path leading downhill toward a river I had heard about from Henry when I met him briefly to get the keys. The forest was thick but walkable, with moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I got closer, and I found the river cutting through the woods, clear and cold, moving fast over smooth stones. I sat on a flat rock for a while, watching the water swirl, feeling calm in the quiet that stretched around me. Days passed quietly. I read, walked, cooked simple meals over the fire, and kept a journal by candlelight. The woods were alive with subtle sounds, the tapping of woodpeckers, the rustle of squirrels gathering nuts, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The sky changed from clear blue to overcast gray, and the first frost arrived in the early mornings, painting the grass white and stiff. On the fourth night, the weather shifted. The wind picked up in strength, rattling the cabin's shutters and making the trees groan. It started to rain, first lightly, then harder. I sat close to the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, feeling the cabin shake a little with the wind. Outside, the storm made the forest sound like a living thing, wild and angry. That was when I noticed something unusual. Around midnight, as I stared into the flames, I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, but the sound was too distinct. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching leaves on the ground, moving in a circle around the cabin. I froze, every muscle tense. The flashlight by the door was within reach, but I didn't want to open the door and expose myself. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, there was silence except for the rain hitting the roof. Then, a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the cabin wall. I didn't respond, didn't move. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. I waited, listening until the forest fell quiet again. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of who or what might have been outside. I found footprints in the muddy earth, big, heavy prints that didn't match any animal I knew. They were too large for a deer, and the pattern was wrong for a bear or a coyote. They seemed human. Whoever had made them was careful, sticking close to the trees, as if avoiding being seen. The thought unsettled me. I was alone in a remote place, and someone had come close enough to the cabin in the middle of the night. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, but the cabin was old and didn't have much in the way of security. I debated what to do. The nearest town was far, and I didn't have a working phone. Calling Henry wasn't an option. I decided to stay but be more cautious. That day, I noticed other strange things. Small signs of someone's presence. A broken branch near the path, fresh but snapped off with force. Tiny piles of disturbed leaves that looked like someone had been sitting or crouching nearby. Sometimes, from the cabin windows, I caught glimpses of movement in the forest, shadows shifting just beyond the trees. I kept the fire going constantly, hoping the light and smoke would keep whoever was out there at bay. I didn't venture far from the cabin after dark. The fifth night was worse. The wind had died down, but the forest felt thicker, heavier. Around 11 p.m., the footsteps returned, this time accompanied by faint whispers carried by the breeze. The voice wasn't clear, but it wasn't the wind. I stayed inside, heart pounding, trying to make myself small and invisible. Then the tapping came again, louder, more urgent on the front door. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I had and edged toward the door. The knocking stopped abruptly. I waited, listening, but the only sounds were my ragged breathing and the rain against the windows. Morning light felt like a relief I had never appreciated before. I checked the area again, and this time I found more footprints, clearer and fresher than before. It was no longer just one set. There were two, maybe three. They had been walking in circles, moving around the cabin carefully but without fear. The realization hit me hard. I was not just being watched. Someone had been camping nearby, hidden, possibly tracking me. The forest that had seemed so peaceful before was now a trap. I spent the next day planning. I gathered as many dry sticks as I could find and made a large fire pit out front, a smoke signal if needed. I kept my knife close and started making a list of what I would do if anyone tried to come inside. I also decided to check my supplies and pack a bag in case I had to leave quickly. The dirt road back to the main highway was a few miles away, and I remembered the directions Henry gave me. I could make it if I started early enough. That night, I slept with the door unlocked but barricaded with a chair and a heavy box. I had the knife on the bed beside me. Still, I was exhausted, worn down by the tension. Around 2 a.m., the tapping returned, but this time it wasn't light or hesitant. It was hard, deliberate, almost like pounding. The door shook as if someone was trying to force it open. I held my breath and gripped the knife tightly. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by the scuffling of feet running away into the woods. I didn't move until dawn. When the first light came, I saw footprints leading away from the cabin into the deeper forest, hurried and confused. I packed quickly, heart racing, adrenaline fueling my hands. I didn't want to stay another minute. The hike back along the dirt road was tense. Every noise in the woods made me jump. I kept looking back, expecting someone to appear out of the trees. But I made it, finally, to the highway and flagged down a passing car. They took me to the nearest town, where I called Henry. When I told him what happened, he listened quietly. Then he admitted something I had suspected but didn't want to hear. This part of the woods was known for people who lived off the grid, some dangerous, some desperate. Henry said the cabin was usually safe, but sometimes people from the nearby towns or drifters looking for shelter would come close or even try to break in. I never went back to that cabin. The weeks after, I felt jumpy, always checking behind me, never feeling fully safe. But I learned a lot that week about fear, isolation, and how people sometimes live on the edge of society in places most of us don't see. What started as a peaceful retreat turned into a stark reminder. Nature can be beautiful and quiet, but it can also hide dangers much closer than you think. And sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real PE. It was the summer of 1998 when I first decided to get away from everything. I was 27, tired of the noise and rush of city life in Portland, Oregon. The air felt thick with stress and too many faces. I craved silence, space, and a place where I could think without interruptions. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours northeast of the city, near a little town called Sisters. The cabin was simple, no electricity, no internet, just wood walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a single bedroom. I found it through a local rental agency that specialized in remote places for people who wanted to escape. The owner, an old man named Harold, assured me it was peaceful and safe. The cabin sat on the edge of a thick forest, right next to a narrow dirt road that led back to civilization, but it felt miles away from anything. I arrived in the late afternoon on a Friday, carrying only a backpack with essentials: some canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, matches, a first aid kit, and a small axe Harold suggested I bring. The sun was already dipping low, casting long orange shadows through the pine trees as I pulled up to the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures, worn but sturdy, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked neatly by the side. The air smelled like pine and earth, fresh and cool. I opened the door and the cabin smelled like old wood and faint smoke from the last fire. Inside, the floor creaked slightly under my boots. I set my bag down and walked around, inspecting everything. The fireplace looked ready for a fire, and the small kitchen had a rusty but working sink and the gas stove I'd seen in the pictures. There was a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with a rough wool blanket. I lit a fire quickly, the flames crackling and warming the cabin instantly. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside I felt safe and warm. I ate a quick dinner of beans and bread, then settled in to read a book I'd brought. The silence was complete except for the occasional crackle from the fire and the soft sounds of the forest outside. That first night, I slept well, wrapped up warm against the cold that seeped in through the walls. When I woke the next morning, the cabin was filled with golden sunlight, and birds chirped in the trees. I stepped outside and breathed deeply. The forest was alive and peaceful. I decided to explore the nearby woods, so I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, my knife, and my flashlight just in case. The woods stretched thick and green in every direction, full of tall pines, firs, and underbrush. The air smelled sharp and sweet. I followed a narrow deer trail deeper into the forest, the ground soft underfoot with moss and fallen leaves. It felt good to walk, to be surrounded by nothing but nature. I walked for hours, sometimes climbing small hills, sometimes stopping to look at the sun filtering through the trees. At one point, I found a small creek trickling over smooth rocks, its water cold and clear. I knelt down and drank some, feeling refreshed. The forest was peaceful but vast, and I made sure to keep track of where I was going, marking trees with small scratches on the bark so I could find my way back. By late afternoon, I headed back toward the cabin, the sun starting to lower behind the mountains. When I reached the dirt road near the cabin, I saw tire tracks and footprints, probably from hunters or hikers. I didn't think much of it and went inside to make dinner. After another fire, I sat by the window and watched the trees sway in the dusk. The next day was similar. I explored more trails, collected some dry wood for the fire, and enjoyed the quiet. The nights were dark without streetlights or moonlight sometimes, but the stars made the sky a brilliant tapestry. I felt almost like I belonged there. Then, on the third day, things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I was chopping wood outside when I heard something rustling in the bushes a little way off. I stopped and looked but saw nothing. Maybe a deer or a rabbit. But the noise came again. Soft snapping twigs, light rustling. I scanned the trees but couldn't spot anything moving. I shrugged it off and went back to chopping. Still, my skin felt prickly. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. The wind was low, so I was sure it wasn't just the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam across the dark clearing. No one there. The forest was still. The next day, I noticed more signs. Near the edge of the woods, where I'd been collecting firewood, I found strange markings carved into a tree trunk. Deep scratches that didn't look natural. They were jagged and uneven. I hadn't seen anything like them before. I tried to think of an explanation. Maybe some local kids messing around? Or hunters marking territory. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. But inside, I felt a growing unease. That afternoon, I decided to take a longer hike to clear my head. I went further than before, crossing a small ridge and looking out over a valley filled with forest and a distant river glinting in the sun. The beauty was overwhelming, but as I turned to head back, I realized I didn't recognize the trees or landmarks. I'd lost the trail. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest all looked the same. Tall trunks, green needles, undergrowth thick and tangled. I pulled out my compass and map from the pack. The map was basic, showing only the main dirt roads and the cabin location. I tried to orient myself, but the sun was moving fast, and the shadows made it harder to tell direction. I started walking, hoping to find the dirt road again, but every path seemed to lead me deeper into the woods. The sky was growing darker. My heart pounded as I realized I might be stuck. The forest felt colder now, the wind picking up, rattling branches. I wanted to scream, but the silence swallowed any sound. I kept walking, calling out, but only my own voice answered back, echoing between the trees. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a faint path. I followed it, my legs tired and my mind foggy. Just as the last light disappeared, I reached a clearing and saw the cabin's roof peeking above the trees. Relief flooded me. I ran the last few steps and pushed open the door. Inside, I lit the fire again and sat down, my body shaking. The cabin felt like a sanctuary. I told myself I'd be more careful and not wander so far again. But that night, the sounds returned, louder and closer. Branches snapped, footsteps circled the cabin, and something dragged along the dirt outside. I stayed awake, clutching the axe, staring at the door and windows. At one point, I heard a low, guttural noise, like a growl. My breath caught, and I tried to tell myself it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the sounds didn't match anything I knew. I stayed alert until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, the noises stopped. The next morning, I found large paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to make of it. The prints didn't match any animal I could identify. I checked my supplies and realized I only had a day's worth of food left. The nearest town was still hours away by foot, and I didn't want to risk walking in the dark or getting lost again. I spent the day boarding up the windows as best I could, piling wood and stones in front of the door. I knew it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I kept the fire burning and my axe close at hand. That night, the sounds returned, but this time I heard something moving on the roof. Heavy, slow steps that shook the old wood. I crouched by the fire, sweating, heart hammering, and tried to stay quiet. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sky started to lighten, the noises stopped. The following day, I debated what to do. I was alone, tired, scared, but I couldn't stay. The cabin felt less safe than before. I packed my bag, taking only the essentials and the axe. I waited until midday, hoping to catch a vehicle on the dirt road. I walked down to the road and waited, watching and listening. After a long while, I spotted a truck coming slowly toward me. I waved my arms until it stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, asked where I was headed. I told him I needed a ride back to Sisters. He nodded and said he'd been in the area hunting. He mentioned the forest had been active lately with bears and maybe something bigger. I didn't ask. The ride back felt like a dream. I was safe, the city noises creeping back in as we approached the town. Looking back, I never found out exactly what those sounds were or who or what had been circling the cabin at night. But I did learn something important about being alone in the wilderness. The forest isn't empty or quiet. It's full of life and danger you can't always see or understand. You have to respect it, stay prepared, and listen to the little warnings your instincts give you. When I finally returned to the city, I felt different, wiser and more cautious. The cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to escape the city for a few days and spend some time alone in the woods. I was 29 then, tired of the constant noise and rush of life in New York. I wanted to find a place where I could just breathe, hear the silence, and maybe figure out some things in my head. I found a small cabin for rent in the Adirondack Mountains, near a tiny town called Ticonderoga, New York. It was off the grid, no phone, no TV, no internet. Perfect. The cabin was nothing fancy but cozy, made of old logs with a small porch, a wood-burning stove, and 2 rooms inside. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. The area around was thick forest, mostly pine and maple trees, with a narrow creek running nearby. The owner warned me to bring all I needed because I might not see anyone for days. I arrived in the afternoon. The air was crisp, fresh. I parked my old car beside the cabin and unloaded my bags. Inside, the smell of pine mixed with dust and old wood. I checked the stove, found some firewood stacked outside, and opened the windows to let the fresh air in. I had brought some food, a lantern, a few books, and my notebook. No plans but to walk, write, and maybe fish in the creek. The first day was peaceful. I walked along the creek, watching the water ripple over rocks, spotting a few small fish. The sun was warm, the birds sang, and everything felt calm. At night, I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned beans, and read a little before going to sleep on the creaky bed. The cabin creaked sometimes in the wind, but I didn't mind. It was part of the place's character. On the second day, I woke early and decided to explore deeper into the forest. I packed some water and a sandwich, put on my boots, and followed a narrow trail marked on an old map I had found at the town's library. The trail led uphill through dense woods, with tall trees blocking much of the sunlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No planes overhead, no cars, just the occasional rustle of small animals in the bushes. I stopped often to breathe, to look at the trees and sky through gaps in the canopy. The air smelled earthy and fresh. About 3 miles in, I reached a small clearing. It had an old, rusty metal barrel lying on its side, half buried in leaves. Nearby, some broken glass bottles and scraps of plastic littered the ground. It looked like someone had camped here years ago but left in a hurry. I took a few pictures with my old camera and rested on a fallen log, eating my sandwich. I wanted to head back before dark, but as I stood up, I felt uneasy. The forest around me seemed thicker, darker, like it was closing in. I shook off the feeling, reminded myself I was just alone in the woods. No big deal. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and pink. I made a fire again and sat outside on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The forest was alive with night sounds now. The chirp of crickets, the hoot of an owl somewhere far, the occasional snap of a twig. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The creaks and groans of the cabin felt louder in the dark. I kept thinking about the clearing with the barrel. Why was there trash there? Who else came out here? The thought made the night feel colder. On the third day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I cleaned up a little, swept the floor, and checked the firewood pile. Around noon, I went down to the creek with my fishing rod. The water was cold and clear. I sat on a rock, watching the small fish swim under the surface. The sun was warm on my back. I caught a few fish, but didn't have much luck keeping them on the hook. I noticed some tracks near the creek, big footprints like from boots, but the prints were old and partially washed away. Still, it made me wonder if someone had been close by recently. I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. Later, while I was walking back to the cabin, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. I stopped, froze. The sound stopped too. My heart beat faster. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the rest of the day. That evening, I made dinner early and sat inside the cabin by the stove. I tried to read but kept looking outside the window. The woods looked dark and deep now. I heard noises again. Distant cracking of branches, faint footsteps maybe, but nothing close enough to see. Around 11 p.m., I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was different. A slow, dragging noise outside, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't want to get up, scared to look out, but curiosity won. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door a little. The porch was empty, but in the moonlight, I saw marks on the ground. Deep grooves, like someone had dragged a heavy object toward the forest edge. I shined the light along the marks but saw nothing else. The woods beyond were black, silent. I locked the door and went back inside. My hands were shaking. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the stove, listening. The next morning, I found something new. By the front door, there were more footprints, fresher this time. Boots, size large, mud sticking to the soles. They led from the woods to the porch and then back again, like someone had been there but didn't want to stay long. I packed my things quickly. I wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I had no cell phone signal to call for help. I was stuck. The day dragged on. I tried to get the car working with a few makeshift attempts, but nothing. I went into the woods to try to find the dirt road, maybe hitchhike to the nearest town. The forest felt strange now. Every sound, every shadow seemed bigger, threatening. I walked for nearly 2 hours, following the road as best as I could. I heard footsteps behind me several times, but when I looked back, no one was there. I saw broken branches, recent footprints that didn't match mine. It was clear someone else was out here, but no one should be. By late afternoon, I found an old ranger station, abandoned and boarded up. I waited there, hoping someone would come by. A few hours later, I heard a truck engine. I ran to the road and waved my arms. The truck stopped. The driver was an older man who knew about the cabin and the area. He told me some locals were suspicious of strangers. Sometimes people left traps or set up scare tactics to keep others away. He said the footprints and dragging marks I saw might be part of that. He helped jumpstart my car and gave me a ride back to town. When I finally left the woods, I felt relief I hadn't expected. The cabin was beautiful and peaceful on the surface, but the reality was different. The loneliness, the unknown people around, the strange signs of someone else's presence. It all combined to make me feel vulnerable, unsafe. Looking back, I understand why the locals were wary. The wilderness can be unforgiving, not just because of animals or weather, but because of people who live by their own rules out there. The trip taught me a lot. Sometimes, escaping to nature isn't about finding peace, but facing uncomfortable truths about isolation and trust. I never went back to that cabin again, but I'm glad I went once, to see the woods with my own eyes, to feel the quiet that's not always peaceful, and to learn that sometimes the scariest thing is not what you imagine, but what you actually encounter. I was 31 the year I rented the cabin up near the Porcupine Hills in Alberta. That was back in 2019. My name's Jared Malone. I'd been working construction jobs nonstop for over a year without a break, just grinding through 12-hour shifts, 5 or 6 days a week. My back was aching, my hands were stiff every morning, and I felt like I hadn't taken a deep breath in months. I needed a break from people, noise, and screens. So when I found a listing for a remote, off-grid cabin, I booked it for 2 weeks without thinking twice. The place was about a 2-hour drive west from Nanton. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. The listing said it had solar panels for some light, a propane stove, and a water pump, but everything else was manual. It was perfect. I loaded up my old Chevy Blazer with gear, an Axe cooler, a few propane tanks, a solar charger for emergencies, and a thick stack of paperbacks. I even brought a trail cam for fun, in case I spotted wildlife. The drive-in was already like stepping back in time. Gravel roads narrowed into a single track of dirt and grass, and then finally into a barely visible trail only wide enough for the Blazer. When I arrived, the cabin was just how the pictures showed it. Small, old, solid logs stacked into a one-room structure with a low porch, a tin chimney, and a shed off to the side. I could smell pine everywhere. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of anyone else for miles. Inside, it was simple. A cot, a small wood stove, a propane burner, shelves with some canned goods and tools, and a table with 2 chairs. Everything creaked a bit, but it was clean and dry. I set my gear down, stretched, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm. The first 3 days were exactly what I wanted. I chopped wood, read books on the porch, walked around the forest trails, and cooked simple meals. Mornings started with mist rising off the trees, and the evenings were full of nothing but crickets and the occasional rustle in the brush. There was a small creek about half a mile down the hill, and I went there every day with my water jugs. Coldest water I ever tasted. On the 4th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. because I thought I heard something moving outside. At first, I assumed it was a deer or a raccoon. The area had plenty of wildlife. I lay still and listened. Something was crunching twigs, heavy steps. It wasn't fast, just a slow, deliberate pacing near the side of the cabin. I sat up and reached for the flashlight by my cot. When I shone it out the window, I didn't see anything, but the footsteps had stopped. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing obvious, no big prints, no signs of anything rummaging through my supplies. I told myself maybe it was a moose walking by and I just got spooked. But I couldn't quite shake the way the steps had sounded. Slow, measured, not like an animal trotting or crashing through the bush. I moved on, mostly. Spent the day fishing at a lake I found on my topographic map. I caught 2 small trout, cleaned them at the water's edge, and cooked them up with some beans that evening. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip down behind the trees, when I noticed something odd in the woods about 100 yards out. It looked like a faint trail, not one I'd made. I walked out to it and saw the grass had been pressed down recently. It wasn't a path made by animals. The width was too uniform, almost like footprints, but the grass was only lightly bent and no clear shoe treads. I knelt and looked closer. It led away from the cabin and curved into the thick trees. I didn't follow it. I marked it in my head and went back to the cabin, but I started locking the door at night after that, even though it barely had a latch. I also brought my axe inside. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing creaks, pops, and what sounded like movement outside again. But when I turned on the flashlight and checked, nothing. Couldn't relax. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't want to be far in case something happened. I moved the firewood inside, stacked cans in front of the door to hear if it opened, and set up the trail cam I'd brought, aiming it toward the woods where that strange trail had been. I felt a little silly, like maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but the hairs on my neck wouldn't settle. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard the same slow footsteps again, crunching softly through the dry underbrush. Then something tapped lightly on the porch wood. Just 1 or 2 taps. I froze. The stove had gone out, so it was cold inside, and the air felt sharp. I kept the flashlight off this time and just listened. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. Then, about a minute later, the lightest thud against the door, like the weight of a hand or a shoulder. Not enough to open it, just pressure. I didn't move. I stayed in my cot until sunrise. When it got light, I checked the trail cam right away. The memory card showed the timestamp had advanced overnight, but no pictures. That was odd. It had been set to motion detection. I checked the settings. Everything was right. It should have snapped something. Maybe the batteries died or it malfunctioned. I walked the area where I'd heard the sounds. I found a small piece of fabric stuck to a branch about knee height. Dark blue or black, torn like from a jacket. I didn't own anything that color. By this point, I was more than unsettled. I took my pack and hiked to the highest ridge I could reach before noon and got 1 bar of cell service. just enough to text my buddy Keith back home. I told him I thought someone might be messing with me and that I was thinking of cutting the trip short. He said if I felt off, I should trust my gut. I hiked back by late afternoon. I didn't like the idea of walking that trail in the dark. When I got to the cabin, the shed door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. Inside, some of the tools had been moved. The old shovel leaned against the wall now instead of hanging, and the extra propane tank I kept tucked in the back was rolled out. Not stolen, just moved, like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, axe on my lap, flashlight off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time closer, right up against the walls of the cabin. I held my breath. There was no sound for a while. Then I heard what sounded like someone dragging their fingers lightly across the wall. Just a soft scrape. Then silence. The first light, I packed everything. Threw it all into the blazer and left without even eating. I kept looking in the mirror the whole drive out. My heart didn't stop pounding until I got back on pavement near town. 2 days later, after I got back to Calgary, I reviewed the trail cam card again just to check. I found something odd. One frame, time-stamped around 2:10 a.m., showed a blurry, dark shape near the tree line. Could have been a shadow. Could have been a person. The angle was off, but the shape looked upright, and you could barely make out what might be a shoulder or head. No face, no details. Just a smudge. I called the property manager and told them someone had been creeping around out there. They said I was the only one who had booked the cabin for the past 3 months. They said they'd go check on it, but I never followed up. I didn't want to know. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still go outside the city sometimes, but only with friends. I think about that cabin a lot. How someone out there had been watching me, walking around at night, touching the walls, moving things just enough to get in my head. I didn't see a ghost, no monsters, just the sense that someone was out there who didn't want to be seen. And I still wonder what they were waiting for, or why they stopped. I don't think I'll ever go that far off the grid again. Some quiet places aren't empty. They're just hiding something. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late September of 2017, after I'd just wrapped up a hectic quarter at the construction firm where I worked as a project manager. Between long commutes, late-night planning meetings, and fixing other people's mistakes, I'd barely had a moment to breathe. I didn't have a family of my own, just a girlfriend I was seeing on and off at the time, and she was out of the country then anyway. I figured it was as good a time as any to get away for a bit. A buddy from high school had mentioned a cabin he'd stayed at once near Flathead Lake in Montana, somewhere quiet, tucked into the woods on the east side of the lake. He said it was pretty remote and perfect if you wanted to disappear for a while. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted stillness. Somewhere I didn't have to hear anyone talking or see anyone's headlights at night. So I booked the cabin for 10 days through a small local rental site, packed my truck with enough food and gear to last me comfortably, and made the drive from Spokane. The road to the cabin turned from highway to gravel after about 3 hours. It was nearly dark by the time I reached the property. A narrow stretch of road winding through thick pines and firs, where the sky disappeared above you. The GPS on my phone had lost service 20 minutes before, but I had printed directions and a topographic map, just in case. The last mile was barely more than a track, ruts and rocks and dry grass scraping the undercarriage of my truck. When I pulled up to the cabin, I was pleasantly surprised. It wasn't run down like I'd feared. It had a metal roof, a small porch with 2 old rocking chairs, and a stack of firewood neatly piled to the side. The windows were shut and curtained, and there was a faint smell of pine and old smoke in the air. I unlocked the front door with the code I'd been given and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one open room with a bed in the corner, a kitchenette along the back wall, and a wood-burning stove near the center. There was also a narrow door to a bathroom that had a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower that pulled water from a rain collection barrel out back. It was rough living, but I liked it. There was no power, but I had a few solar lanterns and a battery pack for charging my phone. Not that I had service. I switched my phone to airplane mode and stuffed it into a drawer. I wasn't planning on using it unless I had to. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I woke up with the light, made coffee on a small gas stove I brought, and spent most of the day reading or walking trails I marked with orange ribbon. The forest was quiet. I'd hear birds in the morning and the occasional rustle of branches from squirrels or wind. I fished a bit in a nearby stream and even spotted a deer one afternoon, drinking from the water. At night, I'd light a fire, cook a simple meal, and sit out on the porch until it got too cold. By the fourth night, though, I started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that something was out of place. It started with the path behind the cabin. I'd made a small trail to take short walks, just looping through the woods and back. I'd marked the trees with small reflective tacks, easy to spot with a flashlight. That evening, I took a walk around sunset. The light was dimming quickly, and I was halfway through the loop when I noticed that a few of the tacks were missing. I hadn't counted them, but I knew there should have been one on a particular tree near a downed log, and it wasn't there. I chalked it up to my own memory or maybe animals rubbing against the trees, knocking them loose. The next morning, I decided to double-check. I walked the loop again in the daylight. 3 of the tacks were gone, cleanly removed, not scratched or fallen. I found one of them on the ground under the tree, still perfectly intact. That unsettled me a bit. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard a single engine or voice since I got there. I brushed it off as overthinking, picked up the loose tack, and re-nailed it to the tree. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside, not the usual forest sounds, just these soft, intermittent snaps, like twigs breaking under careful weight. I'd sit up in bed, hold my breath, and strain to hear more, but the sounds would stop. I didn't want to let my imagination get ahead of me, so I tried to ignore it. On the 6th day, I went to refill the water tank from the collection barrel behind the cabin. That was when I found footprints. Not mine. These were narrower with a different tread pattern. They circled around the back of the cabin and led off toward the treeline. I crouched down and studied them. They were faint, like someone had been walking carefully, but they were there. I followed them a short way into the woods, but they vanished into the undergrowth. Now I was more than unsettled. I didn't bring a gun, just a hunting knife and a hatchet. I hadn't seen a soul for 6 days, and now there were footprints around my cabin that didn't belong to me. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I wasn't sure how much good that would do. It was a simple wooden door with a deadbolt. It wouldn't stop anyone determined. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the bed with the hatchet in my lap and a flashlight close by. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was awake. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Twigs breaking softly, like footsteps circling the cabin. Then silence. Then again. I crept over to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the curtains. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and the dim outline of the firewood stack. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. The next morning, I found something else. Tied to the railing of the porch with twine was one of the reflective tacks, just hanging there. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't lost one since I reattached the others. That was it for me. I packed everything I could into the truck. I didn't care that I had 4 days left. I needed to leave. But when I tried to start the truck, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I popped the hood, checked the connections, everything looked fine. I wasn't a mechanic, but the battery didn't seem dead. It was like the ignition wasn't getting any power. I tried again. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. I was 15 miles from the nearest paved road. I had no phone service, no radio. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was, just a general area near Flathead Lake. I spent the rest of that day trying to figure out what to do. I thought about hiking out, but it was already late afternoon, and I didn't want to get caught in the woods after dark. I decided to wait until first light, pack a small bag, and try to reach the main road on foot. I could flag down someone or maybe find a ranger station. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat in the dark with the lantern turned off, listening. Around midnight, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. Not a branch, not an animal. It was deliberate, A sharp, single knock, then another, then silence. I held my breath and waited. I didn't move for hours. When the light finally started to creep in through the windows, I grabbed my backpack, knife, water, and protein bars, and left the cabin without looking back. The woods felt different that morning, colder, like something was watching. I walked fast, sticking to the trail I'd driven in on, keeping my eyes and ears sharp. After 2 hours, I reached the gravel road. Still no service. I kept walking. Around noon, I saw a truck parked at the side of the road, a ranger vehicle. I waved them down and they pulled over. I told them I'd been staying in the cabin and that someone had been watching me, messing with my stuff. They offered to drive back with me to check it out, but I refused. I just wanted to get to town. Later that day, a mechanic confirmed my truck's ignition system had been deliberately tampered with. Wires under the steering column had been cut clean, like someone had used a blade. The sheriff took a report, but nothing ever came of it. No fingerprints, no suspects, no explanation. Just an empty cabin and a shaken-up man with a broken truck. I never went back. I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe a squatter, a hunter gone wrong, someone hiding from something or someone. Or maybe it was just a person who liked being out there in the woods alone, until I showed up. Maybe I broke their peace. Whatever it was, it reminded me how small I really am out there, how quickly control can slip away. I still camp, still hike, but I stay closer to roads now, closer to people. And I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back, because next time I might not be so lucky. I took a week off from work in the fall of 2019. I was 33 at the time, working long shifts as a maintenance technician for a local transit company in Albany. That year had been rough. I had been dealing with stress, insomnia, and a breakup that left me feeling worn thin. I didn't want to go somewhere crowded or expensive. I just wanted peace and time to be by myself, and I figured I'd find that in the mountains. I found an old off-grid cabin for rent on a site that catered to outdoor enthusiasts. It was buried deep in the southern stretch of the Adirondack Mountains, just outside a tiny place called Wells. The ad said it was accessible by a long gravel road, had no electricity, no running water, no Wi-Fi. There was a wood stove, a hand pump for water outside, and a dry toilet in a shed out back. That was it. Sounded perfect. The owner, a retired guy named Mike, told me by email that it was often used by hunters or people wanting to disconnect completely. He said he wouldn't be around during my stay. I packed my old Jeep with the essentials: canned food, bottled water, extra clothes, a hatchet, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, a camping stove, and a couple of notebooks. I even brought a .22 rifle I used occasionally at the range, just in case. I wasn't expecting any trouble, but I've always believed it's better to be prepared, especially when going off-grid. I left on a Monday morning and drove for over 3 hours, most of it on back roads with no cell signal. The last leg was a narrow gravel lane that twisted through dense forest, branches slapping the side mirrors as I drove. I passed no other cabins, no homes, no signs. Just woods, the road, and the sound of gravel under the tires. Finally, the trees opened up and I saw the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure with a steep metal roof and a covered porch. The front faced a shallow slope that dropped off into thick woods. There was an old fire pit made of stacked stone and a rusty metal chair near the pump. It was almost 4 when I got there, and the air had that dry, smoky scent of fallen leaves. I unloaded my gear and brought it inside. The place was simple: one main room with a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and the wood stove. The walls were unpainted pine, and everything smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. There were a few shelves stocked with matches, candles, and some old tools. It was cold inside, so I made a fire and spent a while chopping kindling from the log pile behind the cabin. That first evening was calm. I cooked a simple meal and ate outside on the porch while the sun went down. The woods grew dark fast, and the silence was deep. No car sounds, no voices, just the occasional rustle of squirrels in the leaves or a distant owl. I stayed up for a while writing in one of my notebooks, then turned in early. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. The next couple of days followed a quiet rhythm. I woke early, made coffee on the camping stove, went for long hikes through the woods, and returned to cook dinner before dark. I started to feel better, less anxious, less wired. I didn't miss my phone, didn't think about work. Just quiet days and long walks under the orange canopy of autumn trees. On Thursday, I hiked farther than usual, trying to follow an old logging trail I'd seen on a paper map I brought. I spent most of the day out, walking steadily for hours. I marked my path with small rock piles and took note of landmarks. Fallen trees, strange stumps, moss patterns. Around 3, I turned back. It took longer than expected to return, and by the time I made it back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. I was tired and a little sore but satisfied. I ate fast and collapsed into bed, not even bothering to light a candle. That night, something changed. I woke up in the early morning. It was still dark out and the fire had gone out. The inside of the cabin was quiet, but I had the distinct feeling that something was off. I wasn't sure what had woken me. I stayed still, listening. There were no noises inside, but then I heard something faint, almost like a soft crunch outside. Not close, but not far either. It was the sound of someone or something walking on dry leaves. I sat up slowly, heart beginning to beat faster. I thought maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of them, but the sound wasn't like an animal moving through brush. It was spaced out, rhythmic, 2 steps, then a pause, then 2 more. And it was slow, not the way a deer would walk. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe wind. I dozed off again, though lightly. In the morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No prints, no signs of anything disturbed. But I noticed that the pump handle was wet, even though it hadn't rained. That struck me as strange. I hadn't used the pump since the afternoon before. It was chilly enough that dew wasn't forming like it would in summer. I brushed it off, figuring I might have left it like that, and tried not to let it bother me. That night, the unease returned. I hadn't hiked far that day, just stuck close to the cabin, splitting firewood and writing. But as darkness fell, I kept looking over my shoulder, drawn to the tree line. Something felt different, like the woods were too quiet. I kept the fire going later than usual and slept with the lantern nearby. Again, I woke in the early hours. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a sound closer than before. It was a soft scrape, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, but from a different side. It sounded like someone walking slowly around the cabin, dragging something. I sat up and grabbed the rifle. I didn't want to go outside, but I wanted to be ready. I held still, trying to calm my breathing and listen. The sounds continued for a while, then stopped. I waited a long time before moving. When daylight came, I went outside immediately. I circled the cabin carefully. On the far side, near the woodshed, I found something that made my skin crawl. There were marks in the dirt, long, straight drag lines. Not footprints, not paw prints. Just 2 parallel lines that started a few feet from the wall and led back into the woods, like someone had been pulling a stick or a tool along the ground. There were no clear boot prints, nothing else. I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't ignore it either. I stayed alert all day, constantly scanning the woods. I didn't go for a walk, didn't even leave the porch. I kept the rifle loaded and nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night was colder, and the wind picked up. I kept the fire strong and left the lantern on low. I didn't sleep well, kept jerking awake at every little creak. Around 2 a.m., I heard the steps again. This time, they were right outside the door. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath, frozen. Then something tapped the window, 3 soft, even taps. Not an animal, not the wind. It was unmistakable. I raised the rifle and crept toward the window, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the dim outline of trees. I stood there for minutes, rifle shaking in my hands. No more sounds. Nothing moved. Eventually, I backed away and waited until dawn, not sleeping at all. In the morning, I found what I was afraid I'd find: scuff marks below the window and faint impressions near the door. No footprints, but disturbances in the leaves, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I decided then I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded the Jeep. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just drove straight out without looking back. The gravel road was rougher than I remembered, and I felt a sick wave of relief when I finally hit pavement again. It was like crossing a border into safety. My phone found a signal an hour later, and I called a friend in Albany to let him know I was coming early. I didn't tell him the full story, just said I had cut the trip short. I never went back to that cabin, and I never contacted the owner. When I got home, I looked up missing persons reports in the area and found nothing unusual. But to this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. What still gets to me is how careful they were. Never leaving prints, never making noise during the day. Just enough presence to keep me on edge. Sometimes I wonder if it was someone living off the grid, maybe just messing with me. Or maybe someone else who had used that cabin before and didn't like anyone else being there. Either way, it felt personal, intentional. Now, when I go into the woods, I always trust that first flicker of unease. I don't ignore it anymore, and I never, ever stay somewhere I can't leave in under 5 minutes. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to the mountains for a few weeks. It was early October of 2019, and the last few years had just worn me out. My job in Dallas had become a grind. My friends were either getting married or moving away, and I hadn't taken more than a weekend off in almost 2 years. I didn't want to go somewhere tropical or busy. I wanted to be alone, just somewhere cold and quiet with no traffic and no schedule. So I rented a small off-grid cabin up in northwestern Montana, about 40 minutes west of a town called Libby. The listing said it was a one-room cabin with a small loft for sleeping, no running water, and solar power for lights. It had a wood stove and a basic propane burner for cooking, and it came with a big stack of chopped firewood. The pictures showed it sitting at the end of a narrow dirt trail, nestled among thick pine trees, with no neighbors in sight. It looked perfect. The owner gave me a simple set of instructions for check-in, told me there was no cell service anywhere nearby, and that I should bring enough food for the entire stay. I packed canned soup, pasta, rice, trail mix, coffee, oatmeal, and about 5 gallons of drinking water. I also packed some basic tools, a hatchet, a flashlight, and a pistol I kept for safety when hiking alone. I didn't expect to need it, but I figured better safe than sorry. The drive up from Dallas took 2 days. I stopped overnight in Casper, Wyoming, then pushed through the last 8 hours to Montana the next morning. It was cold by the time I got near Libby, high 40s in the afternoon, dropping into the 30s at night. Leaves were falling, the trees up in the hills already bare in some places. When I finally turned off the paved road and followed the narrow gravel path that led toward the cabin, I could feel everything slowing down inside me. The dirt trail was rough and climbed steadily uphill. My tires kicked up dust and pine needles as I drove through a canopy of tall lodgepole pines, golden larches, and a few Douglas firs that still clung to their needles. The sun filtered through the branches in long, sharp beams. The cabin was just like the pictures, maybe even a little better. It was small, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a covered porch, dark brown log walls, and a silver chimney pipe sticking up through the roof. The windows had wooden shutters that could be latched from inside. The door was solid and heavy, and the padlock opened with the combination the owner had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine, smoke, and a hint of kerosene. There was a cot-style bed up in the loft, a table and 2 chairs downstairs, some open shelving, and a compact little kitchen area. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag upstairs, and lit a fire in the stove to chase out the cold. By the time the sun went down, it was warm and quiet inside, with the sound of wind in the trees the only thing I could hear outside. For the first 2 days, it was exactly what I needed. I chopped more firewood, hiked a little on the nearby trails, cooked simple meals, and read a book by the light of a solar lantern. I kept my phone off, even though it wouldn't have worked anyway. I slept deeply each night, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in years. There was no traffic, no emails, no background noise. Just silence and the occasional rustle of wildlife outside. It was on the third night that things started to feel off. Nothing big at first, just a small sound, barely noticeable. I was lying upstairs in the loft, half asleep, when I thought I heard a crunch outside. Not wind, not the creak of wood, but something stepping on leaves or twigs. I sat up slowly and listened. It didn't repeat, just silence. Maybe a deer or raccoon, I thought. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to stretch and walk around a bit. The ground was damp from some light rain overnight, and I noticed a few faint impressions in the dirt near the back of the cabin. At first, I figured they were just from a squirrel or maybe a fox, but one of them looked off. It was deeper, wider, and more deliberate, like a shoe print, but without clear tread marks. Almost like someone had been walking around out back in smooth-soled boots. I looked around the trees. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just still woods and damp needles. I checked the door and windows, but everything was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was probably just my own track from when I'd walked around yesterday, maybe distorted by the rain. Still, I didn't like the feeling I had in my chest. That night, I brought the pistol upstairs with me and set it near the sleeping bag. I kept the fire low and the lantern off once I was settled, just in case anyone was outside watching. I stared at the ceiling for hours, barely blinking. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard it again, this time closer. A deliberate crunch, then another, then nothing. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't move like an animal. There were no sniffing sounds, no scampering, just 2 slow steps, then silence. I stayed frozen in place, heart hammering, ears straining in the dark. I didn't get up. I didn't move. I just lay there, gun in hand, waiting. By morning, the ground outside was dry again, but I still found prints. This time, more of them. They led from the trees, circled the side of the cabin, then disappeared into the woods behind it. Definitely not animal prints. Long, narrow, heel-to-toe patterns that looked like a person walking slowly. Too big for a woman, but not huge. The toe of one dragged slightly, like maybe they had a limp. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time, just trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here? Why would someone be walking circles around a remote cabin at night? That day, I didn't go for a hike. I stayed close. I kept the pistol on my hip and gathered some large branches to lean against the windows from the inside. Not for protection exactly, but just so I'd hear if something pushed against them. I also moved the table in front of the front door. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest house was probably 10 miles down a steep road that would be hard to drive in the dark. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to drive that trail at night. I decided to stay just one more night and head out first thing in the morning. That was a mistake. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft sound. Not footsteps this time, but something brushing gently against the outside of the wall. A soft, scraping drag. Not loud, but constant, like someone was slowly running a stick or knife down the logs of the cabin. My throat tightened. I slipped out of the sleeping bag, grabbed the pistol, and crouched low near the edge of the loft where I could peek down. I had left the lantern near the stove, unlit. The only light was from the dying fire. Shadows flickered faintly on the walls. The scraping stopped. Then a new sound, something tapping softly against the window glass. Not hard, not like trying to break in. Just light taps, like fingernails. I stayed completely still. The tapping moved from one window to the next. Tap, tap, then nothing. The rest of the night was dead silent. At first light, I packed everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't even eat. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the car, and drove out of there faster than I should have. My tires skidded on loose gravel and caught in small ruts, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get down the mountain. Back in Libby, I stopped at a diner and used their Wi-Fi to message the cabin owner. I didn't go into details, just said there was evidence someone had been walking around the property at night and that I was leaving early. He replied 2 hours later and said I was the only renter on the calendar that week. He hadn't been up to the cabin in months. I didn't go to the police. I had no solid evidence. Just footprints, sounds, and fear. Nothing was stolen, no one got hurt, and I had no license plate or name. Just someone or something out in the woods who knew that cabin was alone. I went back to Texas and tried to forget it. I threw away the clothes I'd worn up there. I didn't talk about it. I didn't go camping for a long time after that. But sometimes, even now, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment, I'll think I hear that sound again, the light tapping on glass. And I'll remember how out there, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no neighbors, and no help, someone was walking around my cabin in the dark, not trying to get in, just watching. And for me, that was worse. It was October 2019 when I decided to take a break from work. I was living in Fort Wayne, Indiana, working long hours at a car parts warehouse. I had just turned 33, and I felt burnt out. The constant noise, the gray ceiling lights, the forklift alarms. It was starting to mess with my sleep. I was waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. My doctor said I needed rest. So I looked for a quiet place, away from people and machines. I found a small off-grid cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a place called Garden Corners. It was tucked away in the woods and could be rented by the week. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a cabin, a generator, a propane heater, and a hand pump for water. I packed what I needed: non-perishable food, a cooler with ice packs, a camping stove, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, my old sleeping bag, and a hunting knife I'd had since I was 20. I drove up in my 2006 Toyota Tacoma, leaving before sunrise to make the 8-hour trip. The further north I got, the quieter everything became. By the time I passed Escanaba and turned west into the Hiawatha National Forest, the radio had cut out, and I hadn't seen another car for half an hour. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough. Tree branches scraped the sides of the truck, and I had to drive slow to keep from blowing a tire on the rocks. The road ended in a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was just one story, built from dark wood, with a sloped tin roof and a tiny front porch. There were no other buildings around, no power lines, nothing man-made in sight except for an old outhouse about 20 yards into the trees. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a minute. The silence was unreal. I could hear leaves rustling, birds chirping, and nothing else. No hum of traffic, no buzzing electronics. Felt strange but good. I stepped out, stretched, and walked to the cabin door. The key had been mailed to me by the owner, a guy named Russell, along with handwritten instructions on how to use the propane and start the generator. Inside, it was bare but clean. A wood table, 2 chairs, a twin mattress on a wooden frame, and a small counter with some shelves above it. There was no fridge, just a pantry with mouse traps already set. The walls were made of rough logs, and the air smelled like pine and old smoke. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked through the woods during the day, made simple meals, and wrote in a notebook. I didn't bring my laptop on purpose. At night, I lit a few candles, read old paperback novels, and slept better than I had in months. The air was cool and the quiet helped. I woke up with the sun and didn't think once about work. I didn't even keep track of the time. On the 3rd morning, I noticed something strange. I went outside to pump water and saw boot prints in the mud near the side of the cabin. They were fresh, deep, like someone had stepped there not long ago. My boots were still clean, and I hadn't walked over there. The prints were larger than mine and had a thick tread pattern. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I figured maybe a hunter had passed through. The area was popular with bow hunters, and it wasn't hunting season yet, but some people scouted early. Still, it felt off. The prints were close to the cabin. Too close. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing things. Small creaks in the wall, the wind pushing at the shutters, a soft thud outside like a branch hitting the ground. I tried to ignore it, but around 2 a.m., I got up and looked out the window. I didn't see anything. I left the flashlight on the nightstand and laid back down. The next day, I decided to walk in a wide loop around the cabin, looking for signs of anyone passing through. I didn't find much, But about 100 yards east, I found something strange. A rusted metal folding chair, almost swallowed up by weeds. It looked like it had been there a while. Near it were empty cans of beef stew, half buried in leaves. Someone had camped out there recently. It was probably nothing. Still, I walked back to the cabin with a weird feeling in my chest. That evening, I locked the door and pushed the table in front of it. It felt dumb, like I was being paranoid, but I didn't want to wake up to more footprints. I kept my hunting knife beside the bed. I left the flashlight on again. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not the wind, not an animal. It was a kind of scraping, low and steady. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I stayed frozen in bed for a long time, staring at the door, heart pounding. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. When I woke up in the morning, the table had moved. Not a lot, just a few inches. Enough to make me stop breathing for a second. I know I pushed it flush against the door. Now it was off-center, like it had been bumped. The lock was still latched. I checked the windows, all shut. I went outside, walked the perimeter, and found fresh boot prints again. The same ones. This time, they went behind the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I spent the whole day on edge. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking the tree line. I considered leaving, but it was already Friday, and I was supposed to head back Sunday morning. I told myself I could handle 2 more nights. I kept my knife on me and moved the mattress so I could sleep closer to the door. That night was colder. I didn't light the candles. I didn't want any light showing through the windows. I sat in the dark with the flashlight in my lap, listening. It was dead quiet. Around 1 a.m., I heard something on the porch. Soft steps, then a knock. Just one. Not loud, not hard, just a knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. Whoever was out there didn't knock again. After maybe 5 minutes, the steps moved off the porch and faded into the woods. I stayed up until sunrise, clutching the flashlight, barely blinking. When it got light, I went outside. There were footprints on the porch. Clear ones, the same tread pattern. But here's the part that really messed with me. There were no footprints leading up to the porch, only leading away, like someone had been standing there for hours or had come up some other way. I checked around, and sure enough, I found marks on the side of the porch. Someone had climbed up from the side. I was done. I packed my things in 10 minutes and got in the truck. The road out felt longer than before. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting someone to step out into the path. When I hit paved road again, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Iron Mountain. I used the bathroom, bought a bottle of water, and tried to calm down. I called the cabin owner once I had signal and told him what happened. He sounded surprised but not exactly concerned. He just said the area sometimes got squatters or old survivalists passing through. I drove straight home and didn't look back. For weeks after that, I kept waking up at night, expecting to hear footsteps outside my window. I started locking every door twice, even in the middle of the day. Took time to feel normal again. I don't know who was out there. Maybe just someone living off-grid, maybe someone scoping out empty cabins. But the way they moved, the silence, the knocking, the footprints that didn't match up, it felt deliberate, like they were trying to mess with me, or worse, like they were testing what they could get away with. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still like the idea of being alone in nature, but next time I'll bring a friend, and a gun, and maybe stay somewhere with a working phone. That cabin is probably still there, empty most of the year. Someone else will rent it and maybe they'll have a peaceful time. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the sound of that single knock. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo trip to a remote cabin in the Catskill Mountains, about 3 hours northwest of New York City. It was early October 2019. I had just left my job at a startup that was sinking fast, and I needed time away from screens, people, and the anxiety that had been eating at me for months. The idea was to spend a full week off-grid, completely alone, to reset my head. I found the place through a listing site that specialized in isolated rental properties. The cabin was owned by a retired carpenter named Gene, who had built it himself back in the early 80s. He rarely rented it out, but the photos caught my eye. Old wood, no cell reception, a fire pit, and a view of the hills from a back deck. The place didn't have Wi-Fi or even a landline. The listing made that very clear. You either wanted to be alone or you didn't. I thought I did. I drove up in my 2010 Subaru Forester, packed with enough food for a week, a box of firewood, a few books, a map, a hand crank radio, and a big thermos of coffee. The road got worse the farther I went, turning from cracked pavement to loose gravel and then to muddy tracks through thick woods. The GPS gave out about 20 minutes before I reached the place, and I had to rely on printed directions I'd scribbled down just in case. The cabin sat on a small hill surrounded by a mix of pines and leaf-shedding trees that were just starting to turn orange and red. There was no fence, no neighbors, nothing but woods in all directions. I parked beside a weather-beaten shed with a broken padlock hanging from it and made my way up the porch stairs. The key was exactly where Gene said it would be, taped behind a loose board beside the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and old pine needles. Everything was handmade, uneven but solid. The floors creaked, the windows were cloudy with age, and the furniture looked like it had been built from scratch by someone with strong hands and a lot of time. There was a fireplace, a small gas stove, a hand pump for water by the kitchen sink, and an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. The place ran on propane and firewood. I liked that. It forced me to keep busy and think about basic stuff, like staying warm, eating on time, and making sure the lamps were full of fuel before dark. I unpacked slowly, putting things in drawers, stacking my food, double-checking that I had everything. Then I spent the rest of the day collecting kindling from the woods nearby and getting familiar with the area. By nightfall, the woods were so quiet it made my ears ring. There was no wind, no traffic, not even the sound of planes overhead. Just crickets, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, and my own footsteps. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, staring into the dark, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: stillness. The kind that goes beyond quiet. I went to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of logs cracking in the fireplace. The second day went smoothly. I cooked eggs on the gas stove, read half a book, and spent a couple hours following a trail that led down into a narrow valley behind the cabin. I brought my compass and marked trees on the way back so I wouldn't get turned around. It was colder than I expected, and the forest seemed thicker the deeper I went. At one point, I found the remains of a small wooden structure, just the rotted frame of something old, maybe a hunting blind or an equipment shed. It had almost fully collapsed, and vines had grown through the slats. I didn't think much of it and moved on. On the way back, I started noticing little things that were out of place. Small stacks of stones by the edge of the trail. They weren't natural, too neatly placed, almost like someone had arranged them on purpose. 3 or 4 rocks each, balanced on each other in small mounds, spaced about every 50 feet. I hadn't seen them on the way in, but I figured maybe I missed them. I wasn't spooked, just curious. I took a few photos with my old digital camera and kept walking. Back at the cabin, I spent the evening whittling a piece of wood I found by the firewood pile, just to keep my hands busy. The sun dropped fast behind the hills, and I lit the lanterns one by one. Around 9 p.m., I heard something behind the cabin, just a light snap of branches. I froze and listened. Nothing followed. Probably a deer. Still, I checked the lock on the front door, even though I knew no one was out there. I told myself I was just being cautious. By the 4th day, something had shifted. It started with small things. I woke up and found the front door slightly open, just an inch or two. I knew I'd locked it. I remember testing it before bed and even checking it again after hearing that noise the night before. The breeze outside was cold, but not strong enough to push a locked door. I looked for marks, scratches, footprints, but the ground outside was dry and hard-packed. Nothing looked disturbed. I convinced myself I hadn't shut it fully. Maybe the old lock just gave out. Later that afternoon, I found one of the rock stacks directly in front of the porch steps. That was new. No way I missed that. It hadn't been there in the morning. It looked just like the ones I saw on the trail, 3 stones carefully balanced. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if an animal could have done it. But the positioning was too clean. I didn't touch it. I went back inside and shut all the windows, even though it made the place stuffy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something walking through the leaves outside. Not skittering or fluttering, slow, deliberate steps, like boots on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't hear them walk away, just nothing, dead silence. I didn't dare look out the window. The next morning, I found another stack of rocks, this time on the deck rail, right where I usually rested my coffee mug. That's when I stopped pretending this was just animals or wind or my imagination. Someone was out there. Someone was messing with me. I packed up that afternoon. I shoved everything into my bags, barely folding anything. I loaded the car and was ready to drive out before sunset. But the road had changed. About 100 yards down the trail, I found a tree dropped across the path. Not a dead tree either. A fresh one, with green leaves still attached, thick trunk cleanly cut near the base like someone had used a chainsaw. But I didn't hear a saw not once during the week, not even far off. I got out and tried to move it, but it was too heavy. I couldn't drive around it either. The slope was too steep on both sides. I thought about walking the road back to the last junction, maybe 5 or 6 miles, but dusk was coming and the forest felt thicker than ever. I went back to the cabin to figure out a plan. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, lights on, all my bags near the door. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came right up to the porch. I sat in the dark with my hand on a hatchet I'd brought, watching the door. The steps didn't circle this time. They stopped right in front. I didn't hear knocking, just breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone standing inches from the door, waiting. Then it stopped. I waited until morning before opening the door. The sun was up. Everything was still. But the front door had a deep scratch down its center. 3 straight lines like a rake or claws. Not deep, but visible. Fresh. Below it, another rock stack. This time 5 stones. I didn't think. I grabbed the axe from the shed and spent half the morning chopping that tree out of the road. I was shaking, my arms like rubber by the time I finished, but I got through. I threw everything in the car again, peeled out onto the dirt road, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was on the highway. I never went back for the deposit, never contacted Jean. I left the camera behind too. I didn't want any of those photos anymore. For weeks after, I kept thinking about the stacks, how they'd appeared, how someone somewhere had been watching me. They never showed their face, never made a sound. But they were close, too close. I moved to a new apartment later that year. 2nd floor, city block, bars on the windows. I still go hiking, but I don't stay overnight anymore. Not alone. Not in places where you can't get a signal. I know people are out there in the woods, some of them not right in the head, and they don't need to talk or hurt you or even break in. Sometimes they just want you to know they're there, that they see you, and that's worse, much worse.